Kodiak. The morning mist clung to the waters of Shelikof Strait like a burial shroud, obscuring the jagged coastline of Afognak Island as the 42-foot charter vessel Northern Promise cut through the swells toward Seal Bay. Captain Rick Thornton had made this run countless times over his 23 years, guiding hunters into the remote wilderness of the Kodiak archipelago. But something about this particular September morning felt different. The weather forecast called for clear skies, yet an unseasonable fog bank had rolled in from the Gulf of Alaska during the pre-dawn hours, reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile. George Wallace stood at the bow, his massive frame silhouetted against the grey dawn. At 400 pounds and 6'2", Wallace was an imposing figure even among the rugged clientele that frequented these waters. His thick beard, streaked with silver at 48 years old, caught droplets of sea spray as he peered through binoculars at the approaching shoreline. Wallace owned 3 successful auto dealerships across Montana and had been planning this hunt for over 2 years, saving vacation time and meticulously researching every aspect of Kodiak bear behavior and hunting techniques. Beside him, his longtime friend and hunting partner Mark Ellison adjusted his gear for the dozenth time that morning. At 36, Ellison was lean and athletic, standing 5'10" with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his free time outdoors. An electrical contractor by trade, Ellison had grown up in the mountains of Colorado and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read animal sign and predict wildlife movement patterns. The two men had been hunting together for over 15 years, ever since meeting at a hunting expo in Denver, where Wallace was displaying one of his prized elk mounts. "Currents running stronger than usual," Captain Thornton called out from the wheelhouse, his gravelly voice carrying over the rumble of the twin diesel engines. Thornton was a weathered man of 62, his face carved by decades of Alaskan weather, and his reputation built on successfully guiding hunters to some of the largest brown bears ever harvested in the archipelago. "Might push our landing spot north by a few hundred yards," Wallace nodded, lowering his binoculars. "How's that affect our approach to the Salmon Creek?" "Adds maybe 20 minutes to the hike, but keeps us downwind of the feeding areas," Thornton replied, adjusting their heading by several degrees. "Trust me, after guiding hunters here for over 2 decades, I know every inch of that island. The bears have been concentrated along Salmon Creek all week, feeding heavily before denning season." The third member of their hunting party, Dr. Sarah Chen, emerged from the cabin carrying a steaming mug of coffee and her medical bag. A trauma surgeon from Anchorage, Dr. Chen had been invited on the hunt by Wallace after treating his daughter following a skiing accident the previous winter. She was an experienced outdoorswoman and had hunted black bears in the lower 48, but this would be her first encounter with the massive brown bears of Kodiak Island. At 39, she possessed the calm demeanor and quick decision-making skills that had saved countless lives in the emergency room, though nothing in her medical training had prepared her for what would unfold over the next 72 hours. "Sleep okay?" Ellison asked, as Chen joined them at the bow. "Better than expected, considering," she replied, pulling her wool cap down against the morning chill. "These waters are rougher than I anticipated." Behind them in the main cabin, the remaining members of their party made final preparations. Jake Morrison, their assistant guide and packer, was 28 years old and had spent 5 years working for various outfitters throughout Alaska. Standing 6'4" with arms like tree trunks from years of wilderness work, Morrison could carry a 100-pound pack through terrain that would challenge seasoned mountaineers. He was methodically checking their camping equipment and emergency supplies, his movements precise and economical. Tom Bradley, the expedition photographer and videographer, was busy waterproofing his camera equipment and checking battery levels on his various recording devices. At 42, Bradley had documented hunting expeditions across 6 continents and had won several awards for his wildlife photography. His presence on this trip had been arranged by Wallace, who wanted professional documentation of what he hoped would be the harvest of a trophy Kodiak bear. The final member of their group was Lisa Kowalski, an experienced hunting guide from British Columbia who specialized in dangerous game. At 34, she had guided clients in pursuit of grizzly bears, mountain lions, and Cape buffalo, earning a reputation for her ability to keep hunters safe while positioning them for successful harvests. Her inclusion in the expedition had been insisted upon by Wallace's wife, who worried about the inherent dangers of hunting the world's largest brown bears. As the Northern Promise approached the landing site, the fog began to lift, revealing the stunning wilderness of Afognak Island. The coastline rose dramatically from the water, covered in dense stands of Sitka spruce and hemlock that gave way to vast expanses of muskeg and alder thickets. Behind the coastal forest, the terrain climbed steadily toward peaks that exceeded 3,000 feet, their upper slopes already dusted with the first snows of autumn. "There's our beach," Captain Thornton announced, pointing toward a gravel landing approximately 200 yards north of their intended site. "I'll put you ashore in the skiff and then anchor in the bay. Remember, pickup is scheduled for Sunday morning at 0800 hours, weather permitting, of course." The transfer to shore proceeded smoothly despite the choppy conditions. Their gear, including 3 wall tents, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, a 2-week supply of food, hunting rifles, ammunition, emergency beacons, and comprehensive first aid supplies, was loaded into 2 trips of the 18-foot aluminum skiff. By 9:30 that morning, the entire party stood on the rocky beach of Afognak Island, watching the Northern Promise disappear into the morning mist as it headed for the protected anchorage in Seal Bay. Wallace surveyed their surroundings with the methodical eye of an experienced hunter. The beach stretched for nearly half a mile in both directions, composed of smooth stones ranging from pebbles to boulders the size of small cars. Behind the beach, a fringe of coastal vegetation extended inland for approximately 50 yards before giving way to the dense forest that covered most of the island's interior. Fresh bear sign was immediately apparent. Several sets of massive tracks pressed into the soft ground near the high tide line, along with scattered salmon remains and distinctive claw marks on nearby alder trees. "Look at the size of those prints," Ellison said, kneeling beside a particularly clear track. He placed his hand next to the front paw print for scale, his fingers barely spanning half the width of the massive impression. "Has to be from a mature boar, probably 9 feet or better." Guide Morrison nodded, examining the tracks with professional interest. "These are fresh, maybe 6 to 8 hours old based on the definition. The bear was moving along the shoreline, probably checking for spawned-out salmon." Dr. Chen studied the evidence with clinical fascination. "I've read about Kodiak bears reaching weights over 1,500 pounds, but seeing tracks this size in person really puts their scale into perspective." The group spent the next 2 hours establishing their base camp approximately 300 yards inland from the beach, in a clearing surrounded by mature spruce trees that would provide some protection from the wind and rain that frequently battered the exposed coastline. Wallace and Morrison erected the main sleeping tent, while Ellison and Kowalski assembled the cook tent and organized their food supplies. Dr. Chen and Bradley worked together to establish a communications center with their satellite phone and emergency beacons. By noon, camp was fully established and the hunting party gathered around a detailed topographical map of their hunting area. Captain Thornton had marked several locations where bears had been consistently observed over the past week, including the Salmon Creek that was their primary destination and 2 alternative sites along the island's western shore. Salmon Creek is approximately 2.3 miles northeast of our position, Kowalski explained, tracing the route with her finger. The hike follows this game trail through relatively dense forest for the first mile, then opens up into muskeg country as we approach the creek drainage. Based on Captain Thornton's observations, we should encounter bears within the first few hundred yards of the creek. Wallace studied the map intently, memorizing landmarks and potential approach routes. What's our backup plan if the wind shifts or if bear activity is minimal at the primary location? We have two alternatives, Morrison replied. Hidden Bay, about 3 miles south of here, where bears frequently dig clams during low tide periods, and Bear Point, roughly 4 miles west, where berries are still abundant this late in the season. The afternoon was spent conducting equipment checks and brief firearms practice sessions. Each hunter carried a high-powered rifle chambered in either .338 Winchester Magnum or .375 H&H Magnum, calibers specifically chosen for there to penetrate the thick hide and heavy bone structure of mature Kodiak bears. Wallace preferred his custom .375 H&H built on a Montana rifle action, while Ellison carried a well-worn .338 Winchester that had accounted for dozens of big-game animals over the years. As evening approached, the group gathered around their camp stove for dinner and to finalize plans for the following day's hunt. The weather forecast remained favorable, with partly cloudy skies and light winds predicted through the weekend. More importantly, the salmon run in the targeted creek system was reported to be at its peak, drawing large numbers of bears to the area for intensive feeding before winter denning. Remember, Kowalski emphasized as they reviewed safety protocols, Kodiak bears are fundamentally different from interior grizzlies or black bears. They're larger, more aggressive, and completely unafraid of humans. We maintain minimum distances of 100 yards at all times, and nobody moves without checking with the guides first. Dr. Chen asked about emergency evacuation procedures, a question that drew serious attention from the entire group. Morrison explained that they carried 2 satellite emergency beacons capable of summoning Coast Guard helicopters from Kodiak Station, but cautioned that weather conditions could delay rescue operations for days. The nearest medical facilities were over 60 miles away, making wilderness first aid skills absolutely critical for survival. That first night passed peacefully, though several members of the party reported hearing large animals moving through the forest around their camp. Wallace, whose tent was positioned closest to the forest edge, later described being awakened multiple times by the sound of heavy footsteps and what he believed to be bear vocalizations. However, no visual contact was made. An examination of the area the following morning revealed only indistinct tracks in the soft forest duff. September 30th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a light breeze from the southwest. The hunting party was awake and moving by 5:30 a.m., eager to reach the Salmon Creek during prime morning feeding hours. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal, coffee, and energy bars, they shouldered their packs and began the hike toward their hunting destination. The trail was well defined for the first half-mile, following a route that had been used by humans and animals for countless generations. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of moss and fallen needles that muffled their footsteps, while towering Sitka spruces created a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Wildlife sign was abundant, not only bear tracks and scat, but also evidence of deer, foxes, and numerous bird species that called the island home. As they climbed gradually away from the coast, the character of the forest began to change. The massive spruces gave way to smaller trees and increasing amounts of understory vegetation, creating sightlines that rarely extended beyond 50 yards. This terrain, while beautiful, presented significant challenges for hunters accustomed to the open country of the western United States, where long-range shots were the norm. "Stay tight together," Morrison cautioned, as they navigated a particularly dense section of forest. Visibility is limited, and bears can appear without warning in terrain like this. Approximately 1 hour into the hike, Bradley spotted their first bear of the expedition. A medium-sized sow with 2 yearling cubs was feeding on blueberries approximately 150 yards ahead of their position, completely unaware of the human presence. The hunting party immediately took cover behind a fallen log and observed the family group through binoculars. "She's probably 4 or 5 years old, maybe 400 pounds, Kowalski whispered, studying the bears through high-powered optics. The cubs look healthy and well-fed, which suggests good berry and salmon availability. Wallace was fascinated by his first close encounter with wild Kodiak bears. Through his binoculars, he could observe details that photographs and videos had never conveyed. The incredible thickness of their coats, the casual power evident in every movement, and the almost dog-like expressions on their faces as they concentrated on feeding. The family group remained in the area for nearly 20 minutes, providing excellent photographic opportunities for Bradley while the hunters studied bear behavior and body language. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in observing the interaction between mother and cubs, noting how the sow constantly monitored her surroundings while allowing the youngsters to play and explore within a carefully defined area. Eventually, the bears moved deeper into the forest, and the hunting party resumed their approach toward Salmon Creek. The encounter had been educational and exciting, building anticipation for what they hoped would be a successful hunt over the next 2 days. The terrain became increasingly challenging as they approached the creek drainage, with numerous small streams, fallen logs, and boggy areas that required careful navigation. Morrison's experience proved invaluable as he guided them along game trails that avoided the worst obstacles while maintaining their general direction toward the salmon spawning areas. By 10:30 a.m., they could hear the sound of running water through the forest, indicating their proximity to Salmon Creek. The group paused for a brief rest and equipment check before making their final approach to what they hoped would be a prime bear hunting location. "Remember," Wallace said quietly, checking his rifle one final time, "we're looking for a mature boar, at least 8 feet in length. Nothing smaller, and absolutely no sows with cubs." The final approach to Salmon Creek required extreme caution, as bears feeding on salmon were often completely absorbed in their activity and might not detect human presence until hunters were uncomfortably close. Morrison took the lead, moving slowly and stopping frequently to scan the area ahead with binoculars before advancing. The forest opened into a natural clearing approximately 200 yards wide as they neared the creek. The clearing was dominated by sedge grass and scattered alder bushes, with excellent sight lines in all directions. More importantly, the abundance of bear sign was immediately obvious. Tracks, trails, daybeds, and feeding sites were scattered throughout the meadow. "This is perfect," Ellison whispered, setting up his spotting scope behind a cluster of boulders that provided both concealment and a commanding view of the creek bottom. Multiple approach routes, good visibility, and fresh sign everywhere. Salmon Creek meandered through the center of the clearing, its clear water revealing dozens of spawning salmon in various stages of their life cycle. Dead and dying fish lined the banks, creating the powerful scent that attracted bears from miles away. The creek itself was approximately 30 feet wide and seldom more than 3 feet deep, with gravel bars and deep pools that provided ideal spawning habitat. The hunting party established observation positions along the southern edge of the clearing, using natural cover to remain concealed while maintaining sight lines across the entire area. Dr. Chen and Bradley positioned themselves slightly back from the others, prepared to provide medical assistance or document any encounters that might develop. Their first bear appeared at 11:15 a.m., emerging from the forest on the opposite side of the creek like a massive shadow materializing from the timber. Even at a distance of over 200 yards, the animal's size was immediately apparent. Wallace estimated the bear at well over 8 feet in length and possibly approaching 9 feet, with the distinctive wide skull and heavily muscled shoulders that indicated a mature boar. "That's a shooter," Morrison confirmed through his spotting scope, studying the bear's body proportions and estimating its live weight at over 1,000 pounds. Mature boar, probably 8 to 10 years old based on his size and the scarring on his hide. The bear waded into the creek and began fishing with the casual efficiency that comes from years of experience. Using his massive paws like scoops, he captured salmon with seemingly minimal effort, often consuming only the most nutritious portions before discarding the remainder and moving to the next fish. Wallace felt his heart rate increase as he studied the bear through his rifle scope, evaluating shot angles and distances while waiting for the optimal opportunity to present itself. The range was approximately 220 yards, well within his comfort zone, but the bear's constant movement made timing critical. "Take your time," Kowalski advised quietly. "He's not going anywhere, and we have all day." For the next 45 minutes, the massive boar continued feeding, gradually working his way downstream toward the hunter's position. Other bears began appearing in the area, 2 smaller males and another sow with cubs, creating a complex tactical situation that required careful observation and patience. At 12:07 p.m., the big boar moved to within 180 yards of Wallace's position and presented a perfect broadside shot opportunity. The bear was standing in shallow water, momentarily motionless as he scanned the creek for salmon. Wallace's shot broke the afternoon silence like a thunderclap, the heavy bullet striking the bear slightly behind the shoulder and penetrating deep into the chest cavity. The boar's reaction was immediate and violent. He spun toward the direction of the gunshot, roaring with rage and pain while searching for the source of his injury. "Hit," Morrison confirmed through his spotting scope, "but he's still standing." The wounded bear began moving toward the hunter's position, his gait unsteady, but his intent unmistakable. Wallace chambered another round and fired again, this second shot striking the animal in the shoulder and spinning him around. But instead of falling, the bear disappeared into the dense alders that lined the creek bank. "We need to wait," Kowalski said firmly, as Wallace started to rise from his shooting position. "Give him time to expire." Moving too quickly after a wounded bear is exactly how hunters get mauled. The waiting period stretched into the longest 30 minutes of Wallace's hunting career. The forest had fallen silent after the gunshots, with even the other bears in the area seeming to sense that something significant had occurred. Dr. Chen monitored their position with binoculars, watching for any sign of the wounded animal, while Bradley captured everything on video despite the tension that gripped the entire group. At 12:40 p.m., Morrison made the decision to begin tracking the wounded bear. The blood trail was substantial, with bright arterial blood indicating that at least one shot had struck a major blood vessel. However, the trail led directly into the thickest cover available, a maze of fallen logs and dense brush that would make following extremely dangerous. "We go slow and we go together," Morrison instructed, shouldering his rifle and taking the lead position. "Nobody gets separated, and we're ready for a charge at any moment." The blood trail was easy to follow for the first 50 yards, leading through relatively open timber toward a small drainage that connected to the main creek system. But as they entered the dense cover, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet, and the tracking became exponentially more dangerous. Wallace's adrenaline was running high as they followed the wounded bear's trail. His hands were steady on his rifle, but he could feel sweat forming under his hunting clothes despite the cool temperature. Behind him, Ellison maintained position with his own rifle ready, while Dr. Chen stayed close enough to provide immediate medical assistance if needed. The blood trail led them through a labyrinth of fallen trees and thick undergrowth, with the bear's passage marked by broken branches and disturbed vegetation. Morrison paused frequently to examine the sign, noting that the blood was becoming less copious but remained bright red, indicating that the animal was still alive and potentially dangerous. "He's slowing down," Morrison observed at a particularly clear set of tracks. "But we're getting into terrain where he could be bedded anywhere. Stay alert." They had followed the trail for nearly 200 yards when Bradley, who was documenting the tracking process, spotted movement in a thick stand of alders approximately 30 yards ahead. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a dark shape barely visible through the vegetation. Through his rifle scope, Wallace could see the wounded bear lying on his side in a natural depression surrounded by dense brush. The animal appeared to be dead, but Morrison insisted on waiting another 10 minutes before approaching to confirm the kill. "Bears have been known to lie motionless for hours, then spring up when hunters get close," he explained. "We'll throw some rocks to test his response before moving in." Several rocks, tossed toward the bear, produced no reaction, and Morrison finally gave the all-clear to approach the downed animal. The massive boar was indeed dead, expiring from the combination of internal bleeding and organ damage caused by Wallace's 2 shots. The bear was everything they had hoped for and more. Morrison's initial field measurements indicated a skull length of over 17 inches and an estimated live weight approaching 1,100 pounds. The hide was in perfect condition, with the thick autumn coat that would make for an outstanding trophy mount. "Congratulations," Dr. Chen said, shaking Wallace's hand as Bradley documented the successful hunt with photographs and video. "That's the bear of a lifetime." The celebration was brief, however, as the reality of their situation quickly became apparent. They were nearly 2 miles from base camp, with a massive dead bear that would require hours of work to properly field dress and prepare for transport. More concerning, the gunshots and scent of blood had likely attracted other bears to the immediate area. "We need to work fast," Morrison said, beginning to unpack his field dressing equipment. "Other bears will be coming to investigate, and we want to be finished and gone before they arrive." The field dressing process took nearly 3 hours, with all members of the party contributing to the exhausting work of skinning and quartering the massive animal. Wallace's bear yielded over 600 pounds of meat after processing, requiring multiple trips to transport everything back to their base camp. As evening approached, they began the first load back toward camp, carrying the hide, skull, and selected cuts of meat, while leaving the remainder temporarily cached in game bags suspended from tree branches to protect them from scavengers. The plan was to return the following morning to retrieve the remaining meat and complete the salvage operation. The hike back to camp was uneventful, though all members of the party remained alert for signs of other bears that might have been attracted by the scent of blood and fresh meat. They reached their tents just as the sun was setting, exhausted but elated by the successful conclusion to their hunt. That evening's celebration around the camp stove was subdued by the physical exhaustion of the day and the sobering realization that they still had significant work ahead of them. The remaining meat needed to be retrieved, processed, and prepared for transport, while their camp needed to be secured against the inevitable bear visits that would occur during the night. "We'll post watches," Morrison decided, organizing a rotation that would ensure someone was awake and alert throughout the night. "The scent of blood on our clothes and equipment is going to attract every bear within miles." Dr. Chen volunteered for the first watch from 8 p.m. to midnight, armed with a high-powered flashlight and a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs. Her medical training had taught her to function effectively with minimal sleep, and she welcomed the opportunity to observe nocturnal wildlife activity around their camp. The first signs of bear interest appeared around 10:30 p.m., when Dr. Chen heard large animals moving through the forest surrounding their camp. Using her flashlight sparingly to avoid alerting the animals to human presence, she observed at least 2 different bears investigating the area where they had processed equipment and cleaned blood from their hands and tools. The bears remained in the area for over an hour, occasionally approaching within 50 yards of the tents. Before moving off into the forest. Dr. Chen noted their behavior in a small notebook, documenting what she hoped would be valuable observations about bear activity patterns and response to human presence. Wallace took the second watch from midnight to 4 a.m., finding the experience both thrilling and unnerving. The sounds of the Alaskan wilderness at night were unlike anything he had experienced during his years of hunting in the lower 48 states. In addition to bear activity, he could hear the calls of owls, the splashing of salmon in nearby streams, and the rustle of countless smaller animals moving through the undergrowth. During his watch, Wallace had 2 close encounters with bears investigating their camp. The first occurred around 1:15 a.m. when a large animal approached their cook tent and spent several minutes examining the area where they had prepared dinner. Through his binoculars, Wallace could see the distinctive shape of a massive bear silhouetted against the starlit sky, its head and shoulders clearly visible above the surrounding vegetation. The second encounter was more concerning, occurring just before dawn when a different bear approached Wallace's tent and began investigating the entrance where his hunting clothes were hanging to air dry. The bear's heavy breathing and occasional vocalizations were clearly audible from inside the tent, and Wallace had to resist the urge to move or make noise that might trigger a defensive response. Both encounters ended peacefully, with the bears eventually losing interest and moving back into the forest. However, the close proximity of large predators to their sleeping area reinforced the inherent dangers of camping in prime bear habitat and the importance of maintaining constant vigilance. October 1st dawned grey and windy, with low clouds scudding across the island and the barometric pressure dropping steadily. The weather forecast called for the possibility of rain later in the day, adding urgency to their plans to retrieve the remaining meat from Wallace's bear and begin preparing for their Sunday morning pickup. After a quick breakfast, the entire party returned to the kill site to complete the meat recovery operation. They found the cache undisturbed, though fresh bear sign in the immediate area indicated that multiple animals had investigated the location during the night. The second load of meat was successfully transported back to camp by early afternoon, and the group spent the remaining daylight hours processing and packing their harvest for transport. Wallace's bear had provided an exceptional amount of meat, enough to feed his family for most of the coming year, while leaving substantial amounts to share with friends and donate to local food banks. As evening approached, the weather began to deteriorate as predicted. Light rain started falling around 6 p.m., accompanied by increasing winds that rattled their tents and made cooking over their camp stove more challenging. The temperature dropped into the low 30s, creating conditions that were uncomfortable but not yet dangerous. "Tomorrow's pickup might be delayed if this weather continues," Morrison warned as they gathered in the cook tent for dinner. "Captain Thornton won't risk the crossing in heavy seas, and helicopter operations would be impossible in high winds." The possibility of an extended stay on the island was discussed extensively during dinner, with contingency plans developed for various weather scenarios. Their food supplies were adequate for several additional days, and their equipment was suitable for much worse conditions than they were currently experiencing. That second night passed less peacefully than the first, with high winds masking the sounds of animal movement and making it difficult to distinguish between natural forest noises and potential bear activity. The rain continued steadily through the night, creating a constant drumming on their tent walls that would have normally been conducive to sleep, but instead heightened everyone's anxiety about their vulnerable position. Wallace's final watch shift, from 4 to 8 a.m. on October 2nd, proved to be the most eventful of the entire expedition. The rain had stopped during the early morning hours, but heavy fog had moved in from the ocean, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet and creating an eerie, muffled silence throughout the forest. At approximately 6:15 a.m., Wallace heard what he initially thought was the sound of another human moving through the forest near their camp. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, suggesting a large creature moving with purpose rather than the random foraging behavior they had observed from bears during previous nights. Using his flashlight cautiously, Wallace attempted to locate the source of the sounds without alerting whatever was approaching their camp. The fog made visual observation nearly impossible, but the sounds continued to grow closer, eventually reaching the edge of their camp perimeter. What happened next would be debated and analyzed by wildlife experts, hunting guides, and bear behavior specialists for years to come. Through the fog, Wallace glimpsed what appeared to be the largest bear he had ever seen, standing upright on its hind legs, approximately 20 yards from his position. The animal was massive beyond belief, with a head that seemed disproportionately large even for a Kodiak bear. The bear dropped to all fours and began moving directly toward Wallace's tent, its approach silent and purposeful. Unlike the curious but ultimately cautious behavior they had observed from other bears, this animal displayed none of the typical wariness that kept wild bears at a respectful distance from humans. Wallace's training and experience took over as he recognized the potential for a dangerous encounter. He quietly unzipped his sleeping bag and reached for his rifle, chambering a round as silently as possible while keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching bear. The massive animal paused at the edge of their camp, apparently testing the wind for scent information about the humans whose presence it had detected. For several long moments, bear and hunter remained motionless, each assessing the other through the thick fog that limited visibility to mere yards. Then, without warning or apparent provocation, the bear charged. The attack began with explosive violence that caught Wallace completely off guard, despite his alertness and preparation. The bear covered the 20-yard distance to his tent in less than 3 seconds, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for an animal of its size. Wallace managed to fire one shot as the bear crashed into his tent, the bullet apparently striking somewhere in the animal's chest or shoulder region, but failing to slow the attack. The impact of the bear's charge collapsed the tent completely, trapping Wallace inside a tangle of fabric, aluminum poles, and gear while an enraged 1,000-plus-pound predator attempted to reach him. The sound of the gunshot and Wallace's shouts for help awakened the entire camp instantly. Ellison was first to respond, grabbing his rifle and rushing toward his friend's collapsed tent while shouting warnings to the other members of their party. What he saw through the fog would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The massive bear was literally tearing Wallace's tent apart, using its claws and teeth to shred through the heavy nylon fabric and aluminum framework as if they were tissue paper. Wallace was trapped inside, fighting desperately to free himself from the collapsed tent while the bear worked to reach him. Ellison raised his rifle and fired at the bear from a distance of approximately 15 yards, the bullet striking the animal in the shoulder and causing it to momentarily pause its attack. But instead of retreating or focusing on this new threat, the bear seemed to redouble its efforts to reach Wallace, who was still trapped and vulnerable inside the destroyed tent. Dr. Chen emerged from her tent with a 12-gauge shotgun, moving toward the attack scene, while Morrison and Kowalski attempted to maneuver into positions where they could provide effective assistance without risking hitting Wallace with their gunfire. Bradley, despite the chaos and danger, was documenting the attack with his video camera, capturing footage that would later prove crucial for wildlife management investigations. The bear succeeded in tearing away enough tent material to reach Wallace, who was still struggling to free himself from the tangle of fabric and gear. What followed was a brutal mauling that lasted approximately 90 seconds, but seemed like an eternity to the helpless observers who were unable to provide effective assistance. Wallace's screams of pain and terror echoed through the fog as the bear bit and clawed at his lower body, focusing its attack on his legs and torso with the systematic efficiency of a predator that had killed before. His heavy hunting clothes provided some protection, but the bear's claws and teeth easily penetrated the fabric and reached the flesh beneath. Ellison fired 2 more shots at the attacking bear, both bullets striking the animal in the torso but failing to immediately stop the mauling. The bear's thick hide, heavy bones, and massive muscle structure absorbed the impacts without the instant stopping power that such shots would have produced on smaller game animals. Dr. Chen reached the attack scene and fired her shotgun at point-blank range into the bear's hindquarters, the heavy slug finally getting the animal's attention and causing it to release its grip on Wallace. The bear turned toward Dr. Chen with blood streaming from multiple bullet wounds, its eyes reflecting a rage and determination that she had never imagined possible in a wild animal. For a moment that lasted forever, woman and bear faced each other across a distance of less than 10 feet. Dr. Chen could see every detail of the massive predator, the scars on its hide from previous battles, the foam around its muzzle, the small eyes that burned with an intelligence and malevolence that seemed almost human. Then Ellison's 4th shot struck the bear behind the shoulder, the bullet penetrating vital organs and finally beginning to affect the animals to continue the attack. The bear staggered, coughed blood, and took several unsteady steps before collapsing approximately 5 yards from Wallace's position, but the nightmare was far from over. As the immediate threat from the bear seemed to end, the full extent of Wallace's injuries became apparent. His legs were severely damaged, with deep lacerations and what appeared to be multiple fractures from the bear's powerful jaws. Blood was soaking through his torn clothing and pooling on the ground beneath him, indicating arterial damage that required immediate medical intervention. Dr. Chen immediately began emergency medical treatment, applying pressure bandages to the worst lacerations while assessing Wallace for signs of shock and internal injuries. His pulse was rapid and weak, his skin pale and clammy, and his breathing shallow and labored, all indicators of significant blood loss and physiological trauma. "Get the satellite phone," Dr. Chen ordered Morrison, while continuing her examination of Wallace's injuries. "We need emergency evacuation immediately. He's lost a lot of blood and may have internal injuries that I can't assess here." Wallace remained conscious throughout Dr. Chen's initial treatment, though his responses were increasingly confused and disoriented. He kept asking about the bear, unable to understand that the attack was over and the animal was dead. The psychological trauma of the mauling was clearly as severe as his physical injuries. Morrison succeeded in establishing satellite communication with the Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in Juneau, reporting their location and the nature of the medical emergency. However, the fog that had concealed the bear's approach was now preventing helicopter operations, and sea conditions were too rough for small boat rescue attempts. "Earliest we can launch is when the fog lifts," the Coast Guard dispatcher informed them. "Could be several hours, maybe not until this afternoon. Do what you can to stabilize the victim and keep him warm." Dr. Chen continued working on Wallace's injuries, using her medical training and the expedition's first aid supplies to control bleeding and prevent further deterioration of his condition. The worst lacerations required improvised suturing using fishing line and a sewing needle sterilized over their camp stove flame. Ellison remained close to his injured friend, providing emotional support and assistance with Dr. Chen's medical procedures. The shock of the attack was beginning to affect him as well, his hands shaking as he helped apply bandages and monitor Wallace's vital signs. Meanwhile, Morrison and Kowalski secured the camp perimeter and examined the dead bear, trying to understand what had triggered such an unprecedented attack. The animal was even larger than they had initially estimated, with Morrison's measurements indicating a skull length of over 19 inches and an estimated live weight that may have exceeded 1,300 pounds. "I've guided hunters for over a decade," Morrison said, studying the massive carcass, "and I've never seen a bear this size or this aggressive. Something was wrong with this animal. No normal bear attacks humans without provocation like this." Bradley's video footage would later provide crucial evidence for the investigation into the attack, showing the bear's approach, the mauling sequence, and the desperate efforts to drive off the animal and treat Wallace's injuries. The footage revealed details about the bear's behavior and appearance that would prove significant for wildlife management officials. As the morning progressed, Wallace's condition stabilized somewhat under Dr. Chen's care, though he remained in serious condition and needed professional medical treatment as soon as possible. The fog began to lift around noon, allowing for improved visibility and the possibility of helicopter rescue operations. At 12:45 p.m., the distinctive sound of a Coast Guard helicopter approaching their location could be heard through the clearing weather. The MH-60 Jayhawk appeared through the clouds, circling their camp while the crew assessed landing conditions and the nature of the emergency. The helicopter was unable to land directly at their campsite due to the surrounding forest and rough terrain, but the crew located a suitable landing zone, approximately 300 yards away in the meadow where they had first encountered bears 2 days earlier. This required moving Wallace from the camp to the landing site, a process complicated by his injuries and the need to maintain medical stability during transport. Using their portable stretcher and with Dr. Chen monitoring his condition continuously, the group carefully transported Wallace to the helicopter landing zone. The trip took nearly an hour, with frequent stops to rest and assess his medical status during the difficult journey through forest and rough terrain. The Coast Guard medical crew took over Wallace's care upon reaching the helicopter, immediately starting IV fluids and administering pain medication while preparing him for the flight to Anchorage. Dr. Chen briefed the flight medic on her treatment and assessment of Wallace's injuries, ensuring continuity of care during the evacuation. At 2:15 p.m., the helicopter departed Afognak Island with Wallace aboard, beginning the flight to Providence, Alaska Medical Center, where a trauma team was standing by to receive him. The remaining members of the hunting party watched the aircraft disappear into the afternoon sky, relieved that their friend was finally receiving professional medical care but uncertain about his prognosis. The attack had fundamentally changed the character of their expedition. What had begun as a successful hunting trip had become a life-threatening emergency that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The psychological trauma of witnessing and surviving such a violent encounter would affect each member of the group differently in the days and years to come. Captain Thornton arrived at their pickup point the following morning as scheduled, finding a subdued group of hunters eager to leave Afognak Island behind. The weather had improved overnight, with clearing skies and calming seas that allowed for a smooth crossing back to Kodiak. During the return voyage, the hunters discussed the attack extensively, trying to understand what had triggered such unusual behavior from a wild bear. Morrison's experience suggested that the animal may have been suffering from rabies, injury, or some other condition that affected its normal behavior patterns. "In 23 years of guiding hunters in this area," Captain Thornton said, "I've never heard of an unprovoked attack like this. Bears usually avoid humans unless they're protecting cubs or defending a food source. This animal seemed to be actively hunting your friend." "Date, The investigation into the attack began immediately upon their return to Kodiak, with Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, wildlife enforcement officers, and medical experts all contributing to the effort to understand what had occurred. The dead bear was retrieved from Afognak Island and subjected to comprehensive examination, including necropsy, disease testing, and analysis of stomach contents. Wallace spent 6 days in intensive care at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his legs and address internal injuries caused by the bear's attack. His injuries included compound fractures of both tibias, severe lacerations that required over 200 stitches, and internal bleeding that necessitated emergency surgery to repair damaged organs. Dr. Sarah Chen remained in Anchorage throughout Wallace's hospitalization, consulting with his medical team and providing detailed information about the attack and her emergency treatment in the field. Her quick thinking and medical expertise were credited with saving Wallace's life during the critical first hours after the mauling. The psychological trauma from the attack proved as challenging to treat as the physical injuries. Wallace experienced severe nightmares, panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that required ongoing counseling and medication. The memory of being trapped helplessly while a massive predator tried to kill him would haunt him for years to come. Ellison struggled with his own psychological aftermath from the attack, particularly guilt over his inability to prevent his friend's injuries, despite being armed and prepared. The image of Wallace being mauled while he watched helplessly would trigger anxiety attacks and sleepless nights long after their return from Alaska. The necropsy results on the attacking bear provided some answers but raised additional questions about the incident. The animal showed no signs of rabies, disease, or injury that would explain its aggressive behavior. However, stomach content analysis revealed an unusual diet that included significant amounts of human-related materials, clothing fragments, plastic items, and other debris that suggested previous contact with humans. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who led the investigation, theorized that the bear may have been habituated to human presence through previous encounters with hunters, fishermen, or researchers in the area. This animal had clearly lost its natural fear of humans, she explained in her preliminary report. Combined with its exceptional size and apparent dominance in the local bear population, this created a perfect storm for aggressive behavior. The attack generated significant media attention throughout Alaska and the lower 48 states, with hunting magazines, outdoor television shows, and major news outlets all covering the story. Bradley's video footage, edited to remove the most graphic portions, was broadcast widely and sparked debate about hunting practices in bear country. Conservation groups seized upon the incident as evidence that hunting in critical wildlife habitat should be restricted or eliminated entirely. Pro-hunting organizations countered that the attack was an isolated incident that highlighted the importance of being prepared for dangerous encounters with large predators. Wallace's recovery was long and difficult, requiring multiple additional surgeries and months of physical therapy to regain the use of his damaged legs. He would walk with a permanent limp and experience chronic pain that served as a constant reminder of his encounter with one of North America's most formidable predators. Despite his injuries and trauma, Wallace remained committed to hunting and outdoor activities, though he never returned to Alaska or pursued dangerous game again. His experience had taught him profound respect for the power and unpredictability of wild animals, particularly large predators in their natural environment. The incident led to changes in hunting regulations and safety protocols for expeditions to Kodiak Island and similar areas with high concentrations of large bears. Requirements for emergency communication equipment, minimum group sizes, and mandatory guide ratios were all strengthened in response to lessons learned from the attack. Dr. Chen continued her medical practice in Anchorage, but also became involved in wilderness medicine training and bear safety education. Her experience treating a mauling victim in remote conditions provided valuable insights for other medical professionals who might face similar emergencies. Morrison left the guiding business within 2 years of the attack, unable to overcome his anxiety about potentially exposing clients to similar dangers. He relocated to the lower 48 states and found work in less dangerous outdoor professions, though he continued to suffer from nightmares and survivor guilt related to the incident. The massive bear that had attacked Wallace was ultimately determined to be one of the largest Kodiak bears ever documented, with official measurements confirming a skull size that ranked among the top 10 specimens in the record books. The animal's exceptional size and aggressive behavior made it a unique case study for bear biologists and wildlife management officials. Afognak Island remained open to hunting, though with enhanced safety requirements and increased monitoring of bear activity in popular hunting areas. The specific location where the attack occurred was closed to hunting for 2 years, while wildlife officials studied the local bear population and assessed ongoing risks. Captain Thornton continued operating his charter service, but implemented new safety protocols, including mandatory bear safety briefings, upgraded emergency communication equipment, and coordination with Coast Guard rescue services. The attack had reinforced his respect for the dangers inherent in guiding hunters in Alaska's remote wilderness areas. The investigation concluded that the attack was an unprecedented incident involving an unusually large and aggressive individual bear that had lost its natural fear of humans through previous encounters. No specific contributing factors were identified that could be addressed through regulation or policy changes, leading officials to classify it as a rare but unavoidable risk of hunting in prime bear habitat. Wallace's story became a cautionary tale shared among hunters, guides, and outdoor enthusiasts throughout North America. His survival was attributed to quick thinking by his companions, excellent emergency medical care, and favorable weather conditions that allowed for rapid evacuation. Any one of these factors being different might have resulted in a fatal outcome. The psychological impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate victims to include family members, friends, and the broader hunting community. Wallace's wife struggled with anxiety about her husband's outdoor activities, while his children developed fears about wildlife and camping that took years of counseling to overcome. Legal proceedings following the attack were minimal, as Alaska law generally protects outfitters and guides from liability in cases involving unforeseeable wildlife encounters. However, insurance claims related to Wallace's medical expenses and lost income totaled over $500,000, highlighting the financial consequences of dangerous wildlife encounters. The video footage captured by Bradley became a valuable resource for bear safety education, demonstrating both proper and improper responses to a bear attack. The footage was used in training programs for guides, hunters, and wildlife officials throughout North America, providing realistic examples of how quickly situations can deteriorate in bear country. Wildlife officials used the incident to emphasize the importance of proper food storage, camp hygiene, and bear safety protocols in areas with high predator populations. The attack had occurred despite the hunting party following generally accepted safety practices, highlighting the inherent risks of activities in prime bear habitat. The bear's exceptional size sparked renewed interest in the genetics and ecology of Kodiak Island's brown bear population, leading to expanded research programs designed to better understand factors that contribute to such extreme growth. Scientists theorized that climate change, salmon availability, and reduced hunting pressure might be creating conditions that allow bears to reach unprecedented sizes. Wallace's hunting rifle, damaged during the attack, was repaired and returned to him as a memento of his survival. However, he never fired the weapon again, keeping it as a reminder of both the dangers and the privileges associated with hunting in North America's remaining wilderness areas. The tent that had failed to protect Wallace during the attack was analyzed by equipment manufacturers seeking to understand why it had been so easily destroyed by the bear. The investigation led to improvements in tent design and materials for users in dangerous wildlife areas, though engineers acknowledged that no reasonable weight tent could withstand a determined attack by such a large predator. Dr. Chen's field treatment of Wallace's injuries became a case study in wilderness medicine, demonstrating the importance of immediate care in preventing shock and blood loss during the critical first hours after trauma. Her actions were credited with preventing Wallace's death and minimizing the extent of permanent disability from his injuries. The investigation revealed that the attacking bear had been observed in the area for several years, with previous encounters involving researchers, fishermen, and other hunters. However, none of these encounters had involved aggressive behavior, making the attack impossible to predict or prevent based on available information. Ellison's quick response during the attack, including his decision to continue shooting despite the risk of hitting his friend, was analyzed by experts in firearms and bear defense. His actions were generally praised, though the incident highlighted the extreme difficulty of stopping a large, determined bear with rifle fire. The Coast Guard crew that evacuated Wallace received commendations for their performance under challenging conditions, including their ability to locate the hunting party in difficult weather and execute a successful medical evacuation from remote terrain. Their actions demonstrated the importance of well-trained rescue services in Alaska's wilderness areas. Wallace's employer, impressed by his survival story and commitment to recovery, promoted him to regional manager and relocated his family to Montana, where outdoor recreational opportunities were more readily available. The promotion allowed Wallace to maintain his connection to hunting and fishing while avoiding the extreme dangers associated with Alaska's predators. The hunting outfitter that had organized the expedition implemented comprehensive changes to their safety protocols, including mandatory bear spray for all clients, enhanced emergency communication equipment, and revised camp setup procedures designed to minimize human scent and food odors that might attract bears. Media coverage of the attack included extensive analysis of hunting ethics and the appropriateness of pursuing dangerous game for recreational purposes. While opinions varied widely, most commentators agreed that Wallace's experience highlighted both the risks and responsibilities associated with hunting in wilderness areas. The scientific value of the attacking bear's remains contributed to ongoing research into brown bear biology, genetics, and behavior. Tissue samples were preserved for DNA analysis, while skeletal measurements provided data about the maximum size potential of Kodiak Island bears. Wallace's recovery included not only physical therapy, but also psychological counseling, designed to address post-traumatic stress and survivor guilt. His therapist specialized in trauma resulting from animal attacks and helped him develop coping strategies for the nightmares, anxiety, and depression that followed his experience. The incident prompted discussions about the carrying capacity of Kodiak Island for its brown bear population, with some experts suggesting that habitat limitations and abundant food sources were creating conditions that favored the development of exceptionally large, aggressive individual bears. Emergency medical protocols for remote hunting expeditions were revised based on lessons learned from Dr. Chen's treatment of Wallace's injuries. New guidelines emphasize the importance of surgical instruments, suturing materials, and blood clotting agents in wilderness first aid kits used in areas with large predators. The attack location was studied extensively by animal behaviorists, seeking to understand what factors might have contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior. Analysis of terrain, food sources, and human activity patterns provided insights into reducing the probability of similar encounters in the future. Wallace's survival story inspired other mauling victims and their families, providing hope and practical guidance for recovery from traumatic wildlife encounters. He became an advocate for improved emergency response capabilities in remote areas and better education about wildlife safety for outdoor enthusiasts. The exceptional size of the attacking bear generated interest from trophy hunting organizations, though wildlife officials emphasized that the animal's aggressive behavior made it unsuitable as an example of successful wildlife management. The incident highlighted the complex relationship between predator populations and human activities in shared habitats. Insurance companies serving the outdoor recreation industry used Wallace's case to develop improved risk assessment models for activities in areas with dangerous wildlife. The financial consequences of the attack demonstrated the importance of comprehensive coverage for medical evacuation and long-term care costs. The psychological impact on witnesses to the attack, including Bradley, who filmed the incident, was addressed through counseling services provided by victim assistance programs. The trauma of witnessing such violence had lasting effects on multiple members of the hunting party, requiring ongoing support and treatment. Wildlife management agencies throughout North America studied the incident as part of their efforts to develop better policies for human-bear conflict prevention and response. The attack provided valuable data about bear behavior, effective firearms for bear defense, and emergency medical procedures for mauling victims. Wallace's long-term recovery included adaptations to his home and workplace designed to accommodate his physical limitations while allowing him to maintain an active lifestyle. His experience inspired improvements in rehabilitation services for victims of animal attacks throughout the healthcare system. The video documentation of the attack became a controversial but valuable educational resource, with experts debating the ethics of showing graphic wildlife encounters while acknowledging the instructional value for safety training purposes. The footage provided unprecedented insight into bear attack behavior and human response patterns. Research into the factors that had created such an exceptionally large bear led to studies of Kodiak Island's ecosystem, including salmon populations, berry production, and the effects of climate change on food availability. Scientists sought to understand whether environmental changes were contributing to unusual bear behavior patterns. Wallace's family relationships were significantly affected by the attack and his subsequent recovery, with counseling services addressing the impact of trauma on spouses and children of attack victims. The incident provided case study material for family therapy programs specializing in trauma recovery. The attack prompted renewed interest in bear spray as an alternative or supplement to firearms for bear defense, though experts noted that the close-quarters nature of Wallace's encounter would have made spray ineffective. Research into non-lethal bear deterrence was expanded based on lessons learned from the incident. Legal experts analyzed the attack for precedents regarding liability and responsibility in dangerous wildlife encounters, contributing to the development of clearer guidelines for outfitters, guides, and participants in high-risk outdoor activities. The incident highlighted gaps in existing legal frameworks for such situations. Wallace's medical expenses, even with insurance coverage, exceeded $200,000 during his first year of recovery, demonstrating the significant financial burden associated with surviving a serious wildlife attack. His case was used to advocate for improved insurance coverage for wilderness activities. The attacking bear's remains were eventually donated to a natural history museum, where they became part of an educational exhibit about Alaska's wildlife and the challenges of human-wildlife coexistence. The display included information about bear safety and the circumstances surrounding the attack. Follow-up studies of the Afognak Island bear population revealed no unusual patterns of aggressive behavior toward humans, suggesting that the attack was indeed an isolated incident involving a unique individual rather than a broader behavioral shift in the local bear population. Wallace eventually returned to hunting, though he limited his activities to areas with lower predator risks and always hunted with experienced guides and comprehensive emergency equipment. His approach to outdoor recreation was forever changed by his encounter with one of North America's most formidable predators. The incident contributed to ongoing debates about wilderness access, hunting regulations, and the balance between human recreation and wildlife protection. Wallace's survival story became part of a larger conversation about how society should manage relationships between humans and dangerous wildlife in shared habitats. Years after the attack, Wallace continued to experience physical reminders of his encounter through chronic pain and mobility limitations, but he also expressed gratitude for his survival and the quality medical care that had saved his life. His story served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for others facing life-threatening challenges in outdoor environments. The comprehensive investigation into the attack, including analysis of video evidence, medical records, and bear behavior patterns, contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of human-bear conflicts and provided valuable data for improving safety protocols in areas with large predator populations. The next stories. The last light of October. William Harper had always said the mountains would be the death of him, but he never imagined it would happen on such an ordinary Tuesday evening in October. The 61-year-old rancher stood at the edge of his property line, watching the golden aspen leaves dance in the crisp Wyoming wind, completely unaware that somewhere in the dense timber above, something massive was watching him back. Diane Harper called from the kitchen window of their modest farmhouse, her voice carrying across the 40 acres they'd called home for the past 37 years. "Will, supper's getting cold." At 59, she still possessed the same commanding tone that had first caught his attention at a church social in Cody back in 1987. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, caught the last rays of sunlight as she leaned against the window frame, wiping her hands on a dish towel embroidered with wildflowers. William waved acknowledgement, but didn't immediately turn toward the house. Something felt different about this evening, though he couldn't quite place what. The cattle in the lower pasture seemed restless, bunched together near the barn instead of scattered across the field as they usually were at this time of day. His border collie, Rex, had been acting strange all afternoon, whining and pacing near the tree line, occasionally letting out sharp barks at shadows that seemed to shift between the lodgepole pines. The Harper Ranch sat in a valley 15 miles northeast of Cody, Wyoming, nestled against the foothills of the Absaroka Mountains. It was remote enough that their nearest neighbor, Frank Kowalski, lived 3 miles down a gravel road that became impassable during heavy snows. The isolation had never bothered them. In fact, it was exactly what they'd sought when they'd purchased the property with William's inheritance from his grandfather's cattle operation in Montana. Their daughter, Sarah Harper Chen, lived in Denver with her husband Marcus and their 2 children, visiting twice a year when her job at an environmental consulting firm allowed. Their son Michael had followed his father into ranching, but had moved to Colorado 5 years ago after beef prices made their small operation increasingly difficult to sustain. The Harper Ranch now ran just 60 head of cattle, down from the 120 they'd maintained during their peak years in the late 1990s. William finally turned toward the house, his weathered boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. At 6'2", he still carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a man who'd spent his life working the land, though his joints protested more each morning and his lower back ached after long days in the saddle. His grey moustache, which Diane constantly threatened to trim while he slept, bristled in the cold air as he breathed. The barn stood between the house and his current position, a sturdy structure built in 1962 by the property's previous owner, Herbert Stevenson, whose widow had sold the ranch to the Harpers for considerably less than market value because she'd taken a liking to the young couple. The barn measured 60 feet by 40 feet, with a gambrel roof that had been reshingled twice during their tenure. Inside, they stored hay, equipment, and maintained stalls for the horses they no longer kept, having sold their last mare, Buttercup, 3 years ago earlier, when the expense of feeding horses they rarely rode became prohibitive. As William approached the barn, Rex suddenly bolted from his position near the woodpile, running in tight circles and barking frantically at something William couldn't see. The dog's behavior struck him as odd. Rex was typically calm and obedient, the kind of dog who worked cattle with silent efficiency and only barked when alerting them to genuine threats like strangers approaching the property or predators near the livestock. "What's got into you, boy?" William asked, reaching down to pat the dog's head, but Rex dodged his hand and continued his agitated circling, his brown eyes wide and showing white around the edges. The dog's tail, usually held high and wagging, remained tucked between his legs. From inside the house, Diane called again, this time with a note of impatience. "Will Harper, I swear if you let my pot roast get cold, you'll be eating sandwiches for a week." William chuckled and headed toward the barn, intending to quickly check on the cattle in the adjoining pen before heading inside. The barn door, painted red but now faded to a rusty orange, hung slightly ajar, which struck him as unusual since he distinctly remembered latching it that morning after retrieving a bag of mineral supplement for the cattle. The hinges, which he'd been meaning to oil for months, creaked as he pulled the door wider. The interior of the barn lay in deep shadow, illuminated only by the fading daylight filtering through small windows set high in the walls. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and the lingering scent of horses greeted him, though underneath those comforting odors he detected something else, a musky, wild smell that seemed out of place. He reached for the light switch, an ancient fixture installed sometime in the 1970s, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. "Damn bulb," he muttered, making a mental note to replace it tomorrow. He'd been putting off maintenance tasks lately, partly due to the approach of winter and the numerous preparations that required, but also because of a persistent fatigue that seemed to settle deeper into his bones each year. Diane had been encouraging him to see Doc Patterson about it, but William harbored a deep mistrust of doctors, inherited from his father, who'd maintained that if something couldn't be fixed with hard work and common sense, it probably wasn't worth fixing. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, William could make out the familiar shapes of the hay bales stacked along the far wall, the old Ford tractor that had been more trouble than it was worth for the past 5 years, and the various tools hanging from pegboard near the entrance. Everything appeared to be in its place, yet the strange smell persisted, stronger now, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing that seemed too deep and rhythmic to be his own. Rex had followed him to the barn entrance, but refused to enter, instead remaining outside and continuing his anxious whining. The dog's behavior was becoming genuinely concerning. In all their years together, William had never seen the animal display such obvious distress without clear cause. "Hello?" William called into the darkness, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. His voice echoed off the metal roof, returning to him with a hollow quality that made the barn seem larger and emptier than usual. "Anyone there?" The breathing sound stopped. In the sudden silence, William became acutely aware of his own heartbeat, which seemed to have accelerated without his conscious awareness. He stood perfectly still, straining to hear any sound that might explain the feeling of wrongness that had settled over him like a cold blanket. Outside, Rex's whining had escalated to a near-constant keen, punctuated by sharp barks directed at the barn. Then he heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like something large moving carefully through the hay near the back of the barn. The sound was deliberate, controlled, nothing like the random rustling that mice or cats might make. Whatever was making the noise was substantial, and it was trying to move quietly. William's mouth went dry. Living in bear country for over 3 decades, he knew the signs, had heard the stories from other ranchers, had even encountered black bears on his property on several occasions. But those encounters had always been brief affairs, bears spotted at a distance, quickly departing when they detected human presence. This felt different. This felt like something that had chosen to remain hidden, waiting. "Easy now," William said, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing the presence in the barn or attempting to calm himself. His hand slowly moved toward the pitchfork hanging on the wall near the entrance, a tool that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for anything beyond moving hay. The handle felt cold and unfamiliar in his grip, despite having used the implement countless times over the years. The shuffling sound came again, closer now, accompanied by a low rumbling that seemed to emanate from deep within something's chest. William's knowledge of bear behavior, accumulated through years of living in their territory, told him that remaining calm and backing away slowly was his best option. Bears, even grizzlies, typically avoided human contact unless defending cubs or a food source. The trick was not to run, not to make sudden movements, not to appear threatening. But as William began to back toward the entrance, his boot caught the edge of a feed bucket, sending it clattering across the concrete floor with a sound like thunder in the confined space. The noise shattered the tense silence, and immediately William heard something massive rising from the hay, accompanied by a sound he'd only heard in nature documentaries, the deep, guttural huffing of an agitated grizzly bear. In the dim light filtering through the barn windows, William caught his first clear glimpse of the creature that had been sharing the space with him. The bear stood on its hind legs near the back wall, and even at that distance, William could see it was enormous, easily 7 feet tall when upright, with a massive head and shoulders that spoke of incredible power. Its fur appeared dark brown, almost black in the shadows, and its small eyes reflected what little light reached them with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than simple animal instinct. The bear dropped to all fours with a heavy thud that William felt through the concrete floor, and began moving toward him with a purposeful gait that left no doubt about its intentions. This wasn't a curious animal investigating an intruder. This was a predator that had made a decision. William's mind raced through his options. The barn door behind him was open, but it would take precious seconds to turn and run, and he knew with sickening certainty that he couldn't outrun a grizzly bear across open ground. Bears could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, far faster than any human, and the distance to the house would give the animal plenty of opportunity to run him down. The pitchfork in his hands now seemed not just inadequate but potentially provocative. Threatening a grizzly with such a weapon might only serve to escalate the encounter from intimidation to attack. His best hope, he realized, was to make himself appear non-threatening while slowly creating distance between himself and the animal. "Easy, big fellow," William said, in what he hoped was a calm, non-threatening voice, though he could hear the tremor in his own words. "I'm not here to bother you. Just going to back away nice and slow." The bear continued its approach, covering the distance between them with surprising speed despite its deliberate movements. As it drew closer, William could see more details that filled him with increasing dread. This was clearly a male grizzly, probably weighing close to 600 pounds, with massive shoulder muscles that rippled beneath its thick coat. Scars on its muzzle and around its eyes spoke of previous conflicts, possibly with other bears or encounters with humans that hadn't gone well for someone. More alarming still was the bear's behavior. It wasn't displaying the typical signs of a defensive animal. No ear flattening, no jaw popping, no sideways movement that might indicate it was simply trying to establish dominance or warn him away. Instead, it approached with the focused intensity of a predator, its small eyes fixed on William with unwavering attention. William began backing toward the door, moving as slowly and smoothly as he could manage, while his heart hammered against his ribs. Each step seemed to take an eternity, and he could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing in the confined space. The bear matched his pace, maintaining the distance between them while continuing its approach, like a cat playing with prey. When William was still 10 feet from the door, the bear suddenly stopped and rose again to its hind legs, this time letting out a roar that seemed to fill the entire barn with sound. The noise was unlike anything William had ever experienced, not just loud, but felt as much as heard, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity and blur his vision. The sound was primal, ancient, carrying with it the weight of countless millennia of apex predation. In that moment, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the animal, William understood with crystal clarity that he was about to die. This wasn't a chance encounter with a startled bear that might be frightened away. This was a deliberate hunting situation, and he was the prey. The bear had likely been in the barn for some time, possibly drawn by the smell of the cattle or simply seeking shelter, and had been watching him since he entered. The roar seemed to last forever, though it probably continued for only a few seconds. When it ended, the silence that followed felt even more ominous than the sound itself. The bear dropped back to all fours and resumed its approach, now moving with increased urgency. William abandoned any pretense of calm withdrawal and turned to run for the door. His aging body, stiff from years of ranch work and not accustomed to sudden bursts of speed, responded sluggishly. He covered the first few steps quickly enough, but then his right foot hit a patch of loose hay scattered on the concrete floor, and he felt his boot slide sideways. Time seemed to slow as William fought to maintain his balance, his arms windmilling as he struggled to stay upright. Behind him, he could hear the bear's claws clicking on the concrete as it broke into what could only be described as a charge. The sound was like nothing he'd ever heard, rhythmic, powerful, and getting closer with each second. William managed to stay on his feet and reach the barn door, just as he heard the bears breathing directly behind him. Without looking back, he threw himself through the opening and into the yard, Rex immediately running to his side and barking frantically at the barn entrance. William stumbled, went down on one knee, then scrambled back to his feet and began running toward the house, his lungs burning in the cold air. Behind him, he heard the bear reach the barn entrance, but to his amazement, the animal didn't immediately follow him into the yard. Instead, there was a moment of silence, then the sound of something large moving around inside the barn, accompanied by occasional huffing and what sounded like the bear investigating the various items stored there. William reached the house and burst through the kitchen door, startling Diane, who turned from the stove with a ladle in her hand and an expression of annoyance that quickly shifted to alarm when she saw his face. "Will, what on earth—" "Bear," William gasped, his chest heaving. "Grizzly. In the barn. Huge." Diane's expression shifted from confusion to fear, then to the practical alertness of a woman who'd lived in bear country for decades and knew that such encounters, while rare, were always potentially deadly. She immediately moved to the kitchen window that provided a view of the barn and peered out into the gathering dusk. "I can't see anything," she said, though her voice carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Are you sure it was a grizzly? Could it have been Kowalski's bull that got loose again?" William shook his head emphatically while trying to catch his breath. No mistake. It was a grizzly, Diane. A big male, probably 600 pounds or more. It was in the barn when I went to check on things, just watching me. When I tried to leave, it charged. As if summoned by his words, a tremendous crash echoed from the direction of the barn, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Through the kitchen window, they could see Rex running in frantic circles in the yard, still barking at the barn, but maintaining a safe distance from the building. Diane reached for the cordless phone on the kitchen counter, her movements quick and efficient. "I'm calling Fish and Game," she said. But when she lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. She pressed the button several times, then checked the base unit. "Phone's dead." The line must be down again. The phone service to their remote location was notoriously unreliable, particularly during storms or high winds, and the October weather had been unusually active. Their landline was their only communication option, as cell phone coverage in their valley was virtually non-existent, a fact that had never bothered them until this moment. Another crash from the barn, louder this time, followed by what sounded like heavy objects being thrown around. Whatever the bear was doing in there, it was becoming increasingly destructive. William moved to join Diane at the window, and together they watched as their barn, the center of their agricultural operation, became the site of what could only be described as systematic demolition. "What's it doing in there?" Diane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Looking for food, maybe," William replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced that was the explanation. The bear's behavior had seemed too purposeful, too focused for a simple foraging expedition. "Or maybe it's just agitated because I surprised it." As they watched, they saw movement near the barn's side door, a smaller entrance they used for daily access to the feed bins. The door, which William was certain he'd latched that morning, was standing open, hanging at an odd angle, as if it had been forced. "Will," Diane said slowly, "did you leave that side door open?" "No," he replied, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "I locked it this morning after I got the mineral supplement. I always lock it." They stared at the damaged door in silence, both beginning to understand that this wasn't a random encounter with a bear that had simply wandered into their barn seeking shelter or food. The animal had deliberately forced its way into the building, which suggested either unusual desperation or behavior that deviated significantly from normal bear patterns. The destructive sounds from inside the barn continued for several more minutes, then gradually subsided. William and Diane remained at the window, watching and listening, afraid to move away from the house, but unable to look away from the scene playing out in their yard. Rex had positioned himself near the porch steps, still alert and occasionally barking, but no longer displaying the extreme agitation that had characterized his behavior during the height of the encounter. As full darkness settled over the valley, the barn fell silent. No sounds of movement, no huffing or heavy breathing, nothing to indicate the bear's presence or activities. The silence was almost more unsettling than the noise had been, leaving them to wonder whether the animal was still inside the building or had departed as quietly as it had arrived. "Maybe it left," Diane suggested hopefully. "Maybe it found what it was looking for and moved on." William wanted to believe that, but something about the encounter felt unfinished. The bear's behavior had been too deliberate, too focused, for it to simply abandon whatever had drawn it to their property. He had the unsettling feeling that they were still being watched, that somewhere in the darkness beyond their windows, small, intelligent eyes were assessing their home and considering their options. "We need to get to Frank's place," William said finally. "Use his phone to call for help. Fish and Game needs to know about this, and we need to get that bear relocated before it decides to investigate the house." Diane nodded agreement. but neither of them moved toward the door. The prospect of leaving the relative safety of their home to venture into the darkness where a 600-pound predator might be waiting was deeply daunting. Their truck was parked near the barn, close enough to the building that reaching it would require crossing the very area where the bear had been active. "Maybe we should wait until morning," Diane suggested. "Bears are less active during daylight, and we could see if it's actually gone before we try to leave." Before William could respond, Rex's barking erupted again, this time with a different quality, more urgent, more immediate. They looked out the window to see the dog backing away from something near the barn, his hackles raised and his entire body tense with alarm. Then they saw it. The bear emerged from the barn's main door, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that knew it was the dominant force in its environment. In the dim light from their porch lamp, they could see its massive form clearly for the first time, and the sight left them both speechless. The grizzly was even larger than William had initially estimated, with a body that seemed to flow rather than walk, each movement displaying the kind of power that could easily tear apart anything that opposed it. Its fur appeared almost black in the artificial light, and when it turned its head in the direction of their house, they could see its eyes reflecting the porch lamp like two small, cold stars. "Dear God," Diane whispered, her hand finding William's arm and gripping it tightly. The bear stood in front of the barn for a long moment, seeming to consider its options. Then, with movements that appeared almost casual, it began walking across the yard toward their house. Not charging, not rushing, but walking with the patient gait of something that knew it had all the time in the world. Rex retreated before the approaching animal, continuing to bark but maintaining a safe distance, his instincts clearly telling him that direct confrontation with this creature would be suicidal. The dog's retreat brought him closer to the house, and soon he was pressed against the front porch, still barking but now with a note of desperation that cut through the night air. William felt Diane's grip on his arm tighten as they watched the bear continue its approach. When it was about 50 feet from the house, it stopped and rose to its hind legs again, this time not roaring but simply standing and observing their home with an attention that seemed almost analytical. "It's studying the house," Diane said, her voice barely audible. "It's figuring out how to get in." The thought had occurred to William as well, and it filled him with a terror unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Their house, which had always been their sanctuary, their safe haven from the wildness of the mountains, suddenly felt flimsy and inadequate. The doors were solid wood, but would they stop a determined grizzly? The windows were standard residential glass, certainly not designed to withstand the assault of an animal capable of tearing through the barn door. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the bear dropped back to all fours and began circling the house, staying about 30 feet away, but clearly investigating the structure from all angles. They could hear its heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway, occasionally punctuated by the sound of it sniffing loudly at various points around the building's perimeter. "The back door," Diane said suddenly. "Did you lock the back door when you came in?" William's blood turned to ice. The back door, which led from the kitchen to a small utility porch where they stored boots and coats, was rarely locked. During the warmer months, they often left it open for air circulation, and even in winter, they typically only engaged the simple thumb-turn lock that could easily be defeated by anyone with basic knowledge of door hardware. "I don't remember," William admitted. "I don't think I did." They could hear the bear moving around the back of the house now, its footsteps heavy on the wooden deck that William had built the previous summer. There was a pause in the sound of movement. Then they heard something that made both of their hearts stop, the distinctive creak of the back door being pushed open. "The utility room," Diane whispered. "It's in the utility room." They stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of a massive animal moving around in the small space just beyond the interior door that led to the utility porch. They could hear heavy breathing, the sound of items being knocked over, and occasionally a low rumbling that seemed to indicate the bear was investigating its new environment. The interior door between the kitchen and utility room was even flimsier than the exterior doors, a standard hollow-core residential door with a simple knob lock that would provide virtually no barrier to a determined bear. William estimated they had minutes, possibly less, before the animal decided to continue its exploration into the main part of the house. "The bedroom," William said quietly. "The bedroom has a deadbolt on the door, and it's at the back of the house. If we can get there, we can lock ourselves in and try to wait this out." Diane nodded, her face pale but determined. Moving as quietly as possible, they began making their way through the house toward the master bedroom, avoiding the floorboards they knew creaked and trying to muffle any sound that might attract the bear's attention. Behind them, they could hear the animal continuing to investigate the utility room, occasionally bumping into the washer and dryer, knocking over cleaning supplies, and creating a constant low-level racket that somehow made their own movement seem unnaturally loud. They had just reached the bedroom door when they heard the sound they'd been dreading, the interior door between the utility room and kitchen being forced open. The cheap, hollow-core door offered no resistance, and within seconds they could hear the bear's heavy footsteps on the kitchen linoleum. William pushed Diane into the bedroom ahead of him, followed her inside, and immediately engaged the deadbolt. A substantial lock he'd installed himself several years earlier after a series of break-ins in the county had made them more security conscious. The bedroom door was solid wood, much sturdier than the interior door the bear had just defeated, but William had no illusions about its ability to stop a truly determined grizzly. They could hear the bear moving through their kitchen, investigating the various smells and sounds of human habitation. Occasionally, there would be the crash of something being knocked over, a chair, a pot on the stove, items from the countertops. But the destruction seemed almost incidental, as if the bear was simply too large for the human-scaled environment rather than deliberately vandalizing their home. Diane sat on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while William positioned himself near the door, listening intently to the sounds from the rest of the house. Outside, Rex continued barking, though the sound was muffled now and seemed to be coming from farther away, as if the dog had retreated to a more distant position. The bear's movements seemed to follow a pattern, periods of heavy footsteps punctuated by pauses, during which they could hear sniffing and occasional huffing. It was clearly investigating each room systematically, and William realized with growing dread that it was only a matter of time before the animal reached their bedroom door. "What does it want?" Diane asked, in a whisper so quiet William could barely hear her. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "This isn't normal bear behavior. They don't usually break into houses like this, not unless they're desperate for food or protecting cubs." But even as he said it, William knew that neither explanation fit the situation. If the bear was looking for food, it would be more focused on the kitchen, where human food smells would be strongest, and female grizzlies with cubs were typically much more aggressive and vocal in their defense. This animal's behavior seemed more calculated, more purposeful. The sounds from the kitchen stopped, replaced by footsteps moving into the living room. They could hear the bear's claws clicking on the hardwood floors, occasionally catching on the area rugs Diane had placed throughout the house. The animal seemed to be moving more quickly now, as if it had completed its initial investigation and was now seeking something specific. Then the footsteps stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. William strained to hear any indication of the bear's location or activities, but the house had gone completely quiet, except for the distant sound of Rex's barking and the wind in the trees outside. "Where is it?" Diane whispered. Before William could respond, they heard a new sound. Heavy breathing, very close, just outside their bedroom door. The bear had found them. The breathing was deep and rhythmic, occasionally interrupted by sniffing sounds as the animal investigated the door and its frame. William could picture the massive head just inches away from where he stood, separated only by the thickness of the wooden door and his faith in a deadbolt that suddenly seemed inadequate for the task it was being asked to perform. Then came the first test of the door's integrity. A gentle push that caused the wooden panel to flex slightly and the frame to creak. The bear was testing the barrier, learning about its strength and construction with the methodical patience of an intelligent predator. The second push was harder, causing the door to bow inward noticeably and producing a sharp crack from somewhere in the frame. William realized that the door wouldn't withstand many more such tests and began looking around the bedroom for anything that might serve as a weapon or additional barrier. Their bedroom was spartanly furnished: a queen-sized bed, 2 nightstands, a dresser, and a small reading chair near the window. Nothing that could effectively stop a grizzly bear, but William began moving the dresser toward the door anyway, hoping that additional weight might buy them a few more minutes. The scraping sound of the dresser being moved across the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence, and immediately the bear's testing of the door became more aggressive. The third push was powerful enough to cause the deadbolt assembly to groan audibly, and William could see the door frame beginning to splinter around the strike plate. "The window," Diane said suddenly. "We could try to get out through the window." William looked toward the bedroom window, which faced the back of their property toward the tree line. It was a standard double-hung window, large enough for them to climb through, but it was also at least 8 feet off the ground on the outside due to the slope of their lot. More importantly, escaping through the window would put them outside in the darkness with no guarantee that there weren't other bears in the area, and no way to reach their truck without crossing open ground. But as another powerful push against the door caused visible damage to the frame, William realized they were running out of options. The bear was clearly determined to reach them, and the bedroom door wouldn't hold much longer. "Okay," he said, moving toward the window, "but we stay together and we head straight for Frank's place through the trees. Don't try to reach the truck." Diane nodded and joined him at the window. The old sash mechanism protested as William tried to raise the lower panel, creating a scraping sound that seemed to intensify the bear's efforts against the door. After several attempts, the window finally opened, bringing with it a rush of cold air that made them both shiver. Looking out into the darkness, William could see very little beyond the dim outline of the tree line about 50 yards from the house. The moon was obscured by clouds, and the only light came from their porch lamp, which cast long, confusing shadows across the yard. Behind them, the bear's assault on the door had become systematic and powerful. Each push was accompanied by the sound of splintering wood, and William could see that the door frame was beginning to separate from the wall. They had minutes at most before the animal broke through. "You go first," William told Diane. "I'll help you down, then follow." Diane looked at the drop below the window with obvious apprehension, but the sound of the door frame giving way another inch made the decision for her. She climbed onto the windowsill, her movements awkward in the bulky sweater she wore, and William helped guide her as she lowered herself as far as possible before dropping the remaining distance to the ground. She landed heavily but safely, immediately rolling away from the building and getting to her feet. "I'm okay," she called up in a loud whisper. "Come on!" William was just swinging his leg over the windowsill when the bedroom door finally gave way. The deadbolt assembly tore completely out of the frame with a sound like a gunshot, and the door slammed open with such force that it bounced off the dresser he'd positioned behind it. In the doorway stood the grizzly bear, looking even more massive in the confines of the bedroom than it had in the barn. Its head nearly touched the door frame, and its shoulders were so broad they almost filled the opening. For a moment, It simply stood there, looking directly at William with those small, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold far too much awareness. Then the bear stepped into the room. William didn't wait to see what the animal would do next. He pushed himself through the window opening and dropped toward the ground, landing badly on his left ankle and immediately feeling a sharp pain that suggested a sprain or worse. But adrenaline carried him forward, and he managed to get to his feet and follow Diane toward the tree line. Behind them, they could hear the bear moving around their bedroom, knocking over furniture and apparently investigating the space they'd just vacated. Occasionally, there would be a pause in the destruction, and William imagined the animal at the window, perhaps watching their retreat into the darkness. They reached the edge of the trees and paused to catch their breath, both of them breathing heavily from the combination of fear and physical exertion. From their position, they could see their house, which looked strangely normal from the outside, despite the chaos they knew was occurring within. "Frank's place," William said between gasps. "We follow the tree line to the north, then cut across the meadow to his driveway." About 2 miles through the woods. Diane nodded, though William could see she was already shivering in the cold air. Neither of them had grabbed coats in their hasty escape, and the October night was well below freezing. They would need to move quickly to avoid hypothermia, but they also needed to be quiet to avoid attracting the attention of any other wildlife in the area. They began making their way through the trees, using the dim starlight filtering through the cloud cover to navigate between the trunks and avoid the worst of the underbrush. The forest floor was covered with fallen leaves that rustled with every step, and William found himself wincing at every sound, certain that the noise would carry back to their house and alert the bear to their location. After about 20 minutes of careful movement through the woods, they paused to rest and listen. Behind them, they could no longer see their house through the trees, but they could still hear sounds of destruction carrying across the distance, crashes, thuds, and occasional splintering that suggested the bear was systematically demolishing their home's interior. "Why is it doing this?" Diane asked, her voice shaking from cold and shock. "I've never heard of a bear acting like this." William shook his head, equally mystified by the animal's behavior. In all his years of living in bear country, he'd heard stories of bears breaking into cabins and houses, but those incidents typically involved animals seeking easily accessible food or trying to escape severe weather. This bear's actions seemed more purposeful, more personal, as if it had specifically targeted their property for reasons they couldn't begin to understand. They resumed their journey through the woods, moving more quickly now as they gained confidence in their route and as the cold began to affect their ability to think clearly. William's ankle was throbbing with each step, and he could feel it swelling inside his boot, but he forced himself to maintain pace with Diane. The trees began to thin as they approached the edge of the woods that bordered Frank Kowalski's property. Through the remaining trunks, they could see lights in the windows of Frank's house, a welcome sight that filled them both with relief. Frank was a retired Forest Service ranger who'd moved to the area 5 years earlier, and he was exactly the kind of neighbor you wanted during a wildlife emergency, knowledgeable, well-equipped, and unflappable in crisis situations. They emerged from the tree line and began crossing the open meadow that separated the woods from Frank's house. The grass was heavy with frost, and their breath formed visible clouds in the cold air, but the sight of safety ahead gave them renewed energy. They were halfway across the meadow when they heard it, a deep, carrying roar that seemed to come from the direction of their property. The sound was filled with what could only be described as rage, and it carried clearly across the distance, despite the wind and the buffer of trees between them and their home. "It found something," William said grimly, "or it's frustrated that we got away." They reached Frank's front porch and began pounding on the door, calling his name and explaining in urgent, overlapping sentences that they needed help. Within seconds, the porch light came on, and they could hear Frank moving around inside, unlocking multiple deadbolts and disengaging what sounded like a security chain. Frank Kowalski opened the door wearing a flannel robe and the expression of concern that quickly shifted to alarm when he saw their condition. At 67, Frank still maintained the alert posture and quick reflexes of his years in law enforcement, and he immediately began assessing the situation with professional efficiency. "Bear," William said simply. "Grizzly, at our place. It's in the house." Frank's eyes widened slightly, but he immediately stepped aside and ushered them into his warm living room. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you some blankets and coffee, then we'll call Fish and Game." As Frank moved toward his kitchen, William and Diane collapsed onto his sofa, finally allowing themselves to feel the full impact of what they'd just experienced. The warmth of the house made them both begin shivering violently as their bodies tried to adjust to the temperature change, and the adrenaline that had carried them through their escape began to fade, leaving them feeling shaky and disoriented. Frank returned with thick wool blankets and steaming mugs of coffee, then sat across from them with a notepad and pen. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. The more details I can give Fish and Game, the better they'll be able to respond." Over the next 30 minutes, William and Diane related their entire experience, from William's first encounter with the bear in the barn through their escape from the house. Frank listened intently, occasionally asking questions for clarification, but mostly just letting them talk through the traumatic events. When they finished their account, Frank was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. "That's not normal bear behavior," he said finally. "Not even close. A grizzly breaking into a house and systematically searching it, then staying to destroy the interior instead of leaving once it found no food. That suggests either illness, injury, or conditioning to human environments that's made it unusually aggressive." Frank picked up his phone and dialed the emergency number for Wyoming Fish and Game, speaking quickly and efficiently with the dispatcher, while William and Diane listened to his side of the conversation. He provided their location, described the bear's behavior in clinical terms, and emphasized the unusual nature of the encounter. "They're sending a team," Frank said after hanging up, "but it won't be until morning. They don't do bear response calls in the dark unless there's an immediate threat to human life, and since you're safe here, they consider the situation contained for now." The thought of their home being destroyed while they waited helplessly was almost unbearable, but William knew Frank was right about the dangers of confronting a grizzly in the darkness. Even experienced wildlife officers with proper equipment and training avoided such encounters when possible. "What about our cattle?" Diane asked suddenly. "If it decides to go after the livestock?" "Possible," Frank admitted, "but not likely. Grizzlies can take down cattle, but it's not their preferred prey. They're more likely to scavenge than hunt healthy adult cattle, and if this bear is focused on your house and property, it might not even notice the livestock." Throughout the night, they could occasionally hear sounds carrying across the distance from the direction of the Harper Ranch, crashes, thuds, and periodic roaring that suggested the bear was continuing its destructive activities. Each sound made William wince, knowing that decades of accumulated possessions and memories were being systematically destroyed. As dawn approached, Frank made another pot of coffee and began checking his equipment. As a retired ranger, he maintained a substantial collection of wildlife management tools, including powerful flashlights, binoculars, bear spray, and even a tranquilizer gun he was certified to use in emergency situations. "When Fish and Game gets here," Frank explained, "they're going to want to assess the situation before taking any action. If the bear is still on the property, they'll probably try to tranquilize it first, then relocate it to a more remote area. If it's already left, they'll secure the property and investigate what might have attracted it in the first place. The sounds from the Harper Ranch had stopped about an hour before sunrise, leading them to hope that the bear had finally moved on. But when the fish and game vehicles arrived at Frank's house just after 7 a.m., the team leader, a woman named Janet Morrison, who Frank knew from his ranger days, explained that their first priority would be to ensure the bear was actually gone before allowing anyone back onto the property. Janet Morrison was a compact, efficient woman in her 40s who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent her career dealing with dangerous wildlife. She listened to William and Diane's account with the same professional attention Frank had shown, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about the bear's size, behavior, and the timeline of events. "Based on your description," Janet said when they'd finished, "this sounds like a mature male grizzly, probably weighing between 500 and 600 pounds. The behavior you're describing is highly unusual, which suggests either a sick animal or one that's been conditioned to associate human properties with food sources." Janet's team consisted of 3 other officers, each equipped with specialized gear for dealing with large predators. They had tranquilizer guns, bear spray, protective equipment, and a truck equipped with a heavy cage for transporting captured animals. "We're going to approach your property carefully," Janet explained. "Our first priority is to determine if the bear is still in the area. If it is, we'll assess its behavior and decide whether to attempt capture or simply drive it away from human habitation. Either way, you won't be able to return to your house until we've completed our investigation." Frank offered to guide the team to the Harper Ranch, and after some discussion, Janet agreed that his local knowledge and experience would be valuable. William wanted to accompany them as well, but Janet firmly refused, explaining that civilians at the scene would complicate their response and potentially put everyone at greater risk. So William and Diane remained at Frank's house, watching through binoculars as the fish and game vehicles made their way across the meadow toward their property. From their distant vantage point, they could see their house, which appeared intact from the outside, and the barn, which showed obvious signs of damage even at this distance. The fish and game team spent nearly 2 hours on the property, moving systematically from building to building and obviously taking extensive notes and photographs. Through the binoculars, William could see officers examining the barn's damaged doors, investigating the house's exterior, and setting up what appeared to be monitoring equipment at various points around the property. When Frank finally returned, his expression was grim. "The bear's gone," he reported. "Probably left sometime before dawn. But the damage to your house?" Frank paused, clearly struggling to find appropriate words. "It's extensive, Will. The interior is pretty much destroyed. Furniture overturned, cabinets torn open, appliances pulled away from the walls. It looks like the bear spent hours in there, just systematically tearing everything apart." The news hit William like a physical blow. Their home, the center of their life together for over 3 decades, had been transformed into a crime scene by a single night's encounter with a wild animal. All their possessions, their photographs, Diane's collection of antique dishes, the furniture they'd carefully selected over the years, all of it damaged or destroyed by an animal whose motivations they couldn't begin to understand. "Janet wants to talk to you both," Frank continued. "They found some things in the house that they want to ask you about, and they need to understand more about your recent activities and anything that might have attracted the bear to your property." When Janet Morrison arrived at Frank's house an hour later, she carried a clipboard thick with notes and photographs. Her expression was serious, and William got the impression that her investigation had raised more questions than it had answered. "I need to ask you some specific questions about the past few weeks," Janet began. "Has there been any unusual activity on your property? Any changes to your routine? Any new food sources that might attract wildlife?" William and Diane exchanged glances, both trying to think of anything that might have drawn a grizzly to their ranch. They'd been following the same basic routines for years, caring for their cattle, maintaining their property, storing their garbage in bear-proof containers as required by county ordinances. "Nothing unusual," William said finally. "We've been preparing for winter, getting the cattle ready for the cold weather, but nothing we haven't done every year for the past 3 decades. Janet made notes, then looked up with an expression that suggested she had more difficult questions to ask. "Did you recently process any meat on your property? Hunting, butchering livestock, anything that might have created strong odors?" "We had a steer butchered about 3 weeks ago," Diane said, "but that was done professionally, off-site. We just brought home the packaged meat." "Where did you store it?" "In the freezer in the basement," William replied, then felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications. "The freezer that's directly below the kitchen." Janet nodded grimly. "That's probably what initially attracted the bear. Even though the meat was frozen and packaged, the scent would have been detectable to an animal with a grizzly's sense of smell. Once the bear was on your property investigating that odor, it would have found other scents associated with human habitation." "But even that explanation didn't fully account for the bear's behavior," Janet explained. "Most bears attracted to human properties would investigate briefly, possibly attempt to access food sources, then leave when they found the area too risky or unrewarding. This bear's systematic destruction of their home suggested a level of investment in the property that went far beyond normal foraging behavior." "There's something else," Janet said, consulting her notes. "We found evidence that this bear had been on your property multiple times over the past several weeks. Tracks around your barn, claw marks on trees near your house, scat deposits that appear to be from the same animal at various locations on your ranch. The revelation that they'd been under surveillance by a grizzly bear for weeks without their knowledge was deeply unsettling." William thought back over the past month, trying to remember any signs they might have missed, any unusual behavior from their livestock or their dog that might have indicated a predator's presence. "Rex had been acting strange lately," Diane said suddenly, "more nervous than usual, barking at things we couldn't see." "We thought it was just the changing weather." "Dogs often detect bear presence long before humans do," Janet confirmed. "Their sense of smell and hearing are much better than ours, and they're naturally alert to predators. Your dog was probably trying to warn you, but you didn't recognize the signs." Janet spent another hour gathering information about the Harper Ranch's layout, their daily routines, and the local wildlife population. She explained that Fish and Game would be monitoring the area for the next several weeks, using trail cameras and other equipment to track the bear's movements and determine whether it posed a continuing threat to human safety. "The good news is that we don't think this bear is sick or injured," Janet concluded. "Its behavior, while unusual, was too systematic and purposeful to indicate disease. The bad news is that it's clearly learned to associate human properties with food sources, which makes it potentially dangerous to other residents in the area." When Janet's team finally departed, William and Diane were left to confront the reality of their situation. Their home was uninhabitable, their sense of security had been shattered, and they had no idea when or if they might be able to return to the life they'd built on their remote ranch. Frank immediately offered to let them stay in his guest room for as long as necessary, and over the following days, other neighbors and community members reached out with similar offers of assistance. The story of their encounter spread quickly through the rural community, generating a mixture of sympathy, fascination, and concern among residents who'd lived with the knowledge of grisly presence but had never experienced such a direct and dramatic encounter. Their insurance company dispatched an adjuster who spent 2 days documenting the damage to their home and possessions. The adjuster, a city-based professional who'd never seen wildlife damage on such a scale, seemed almost overwhelmed by the scope of the destruction. Every room showed evidence of the bear's presence: overturned furniture, torn upholstery, damaged walls where the animal had apparently scratched or bumped into surfaces. The kitchen, where the bear had spent considerable time, was particularly devastated. Cabinets had been torn open, their contents scattered across the floor. The refrigerator had been pulled away from the wall and tipped over, spilling spoiled food across the linoleum. Even the sink had been damaged, apparently by the bear's weight as it investigated the counter surfaces. But perhaps most unsettling was the master bedroom, where the bear had spent time after breaking through the door. The bed had been completely destroyed, the mattress shredded, and the frame twisted beyond repair. Clothes from their dresser and closet had been scattered throughout the room, many bearing claw marks that served as tangible reminders of how close they'd come to a potentially fatal encounter. The insurance adjuster estimated that rebuilding and refurnishing their home would take at least 6 months and cost well over $100,000. More challenging than the financial impact, however, was the psychological aftermath of the encounter. Neither William nor Diane slept well during their first week at Frank's house. Despite the safety and comfort of their temporary accommodations, they found themselves starting at unexpected sounds, checking locks multiple times before bed, and experiencing vivid dreams that replayed and distorted their memory of that terrifying night. Dr. Patricia Henley, a psychologist in Cody who specialized in trauma counseling, explained that their reactions were entirely normal responses to a life-threatening encounter with a predator. The human mind, she said, was not designed to process the experience of being hunted by a creature capable of killing them with a single blow, and the after-effects could persist for months or even years. "You've experienced something that triggers our most primitive survival instincts," Dr. Henley explained during one of their counseling sessions. "Your brains are still in high alert mode, constantly scanning for threats and preparing for another encounter. It takes time for that response to diminish, and it may never completely disappear." The story of their encounter attracted attention beyond their immediate community. A reporter from the Billings Gazette interviewed them extensively, producing a front-page article that was subsequently picked up by regional and even national news outlets. Wildlife officials from across the region contacted Janet Morrison, seeking details about the bear's unusual behavior and its implications for human-wildlife interaction policies. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a bear behavior specialist from the University of Montana, visited their property as part of a research project studying unusual grizzly behavior. Dr. Martinez explained that while their encounter was highly unusual, it wasn't entirely unprecedented. There were documented cases of individual bears developing what she termed problem behaviors that went far beyond normal food-seeking activities. Some bears seem to develop a fascination with human environments that goes beyond simple foraging, Dr. Martinez explained. They become almost obsessed with investigating human spaces, even when those spaces don't contain obvious food rewards. It's as if they're trying to understand something about human behavior that we can't yet identify. Dr. Martinez's theory was that their bear might have been what researchers call a sentinel animal, an individual that serves as an advanced scout for other bears, investigating human activities and reporting back to the larger population through scent marking and other communication methods. While the theory was speculative, it offered one possible explanation for the animal's systematic investigation of their property. 3 weeks after their encounter, Janet Morrison contacted them with news that trail cameras had captured images of what appeared to be the same bear approximately 15 miles from their ranch, moving steadily westward toward more remote mountain terrain. The animal appeared healthy and was showing normal foraging behavior, suggesting that whatever had driven it to their property might have been a temporary aberration rather than a permanent change in its behavioral patterns. The news provided some relief, but it didn't eliminate their concerns about returning to their property. Even if this particular bear had moved on, the encounter had demonstrated their vulnerability in ways they'd never fully appreciated during their decades of rural living. William found himself researching security systems, reinforced doors, and even the possibility of installing bears-resistant barriers around their home. The ranch that had once felt like a peaceful refuge from the world now seemed exposed and defensible, surrounded by wilderness that no longer felt benign. Diane struggled with different concerns. The systematic destruction of their possessions felt personal in a way that a simple break-in or natural disaster might not have. Their home had been violated by an intelligence that was alien yet somehow purposeful, leaving her feeling that the space could never again provide the sense of sanctuary it once had. The rebuilding process began in November, but it would extend well into the following spring. Working with contractors who had experience with wildlife-resistant construction, they planned modifications that would make their home more secure without completely abandoning the rural lifestyle they loved. The new design included reinforced doors and windows, improved lighting around the property's perimeter, and a security system that could detect large animals moving near the house. They also installed what their contractor called bear-resistant features: stronger locks, reinforced door frames, and even metal shutters that could be quickly deployed over windows if necessary. But perhaps more significant than the physical changes were the behavioral modifications they found themselves making. They no longer left the house after dark without flashlights and bear spray. They installed motion sensor lights throughout their property. Most importantly, they developed new awareness of their environment, constantly watching for signs of wildlife presence that they might once have overlooked. Rex, their border collie, seemed to sense their increased vigilance and responded by becoming even more alert to his surroundings. The dog that had once roamed freely around their property now stayed closer to the house, and his barking at unseen disturbances was treated with much greater seriousness. Their relationship with their environment had been fundamentally altered by a single night's encounter with a wild animal. The mountains they'd loved for their beauty and remoteness now seemed to harbor threats that could materialize without warning. The wildlife they'd once enjoyed observing from a distance now represented potential dangers that required constant awareness and preparation. Yet despite these changes, they chose to remain on their ranch. The alternative, moving to town, abandoning the life they'd built, surrendering to fear, felt like a greater defeat than learning to live with increased caution and respect for the wild creatures with whom they shared the landscape. When they finally moved back into their rebuilt home in April, it felt both familiar and foreign. The layout was the same, but the new security features served as constant reminders of their vulnerability. The view from their kitchen window was unchanged, but they found themselves scanning the tree line for movement with an attention they'd never felt necessary before. Frank Kowalski, who had become not just a neighbor but a close friend through their months of displacement, helped them establish new routines designed to minimize their risk of future wildlife encounters. Together, they created what he called a threat assessment protocol, a systematic approach to daily activities that included checking for tracks or other signs of predator presence before venturing outside. The protocol seemed excessive at first, but it provided a sense of control over circumstances that had once seemed entirely beyond their influence. By taking deliberate precautions and maintaining heightened awareness, they could live with the knowledge that they shared their environment with creatures capable of ending their lives in seconds. Their story became part of local folklore, told and retold in coffee shops and community gatherings throughout the region. Each retelling seemed to add new details or interpretations, but the core narrative remained consistent. The night a grizzly bear systematically destroyed a family's home while they escaped through a bedroom window into the Wyoming darkness. For William and Diane Harper, however, the story wasn't folklore or entertainment. It was a permanent reminder that the boundary between civilization and wilderness was far thinner than most people realized, and that crossing that boundary, even inadvertently, could have consequences that lasted far longer than the few hours of terror they'd experienced. A year after their encounter, they still lived on their ranch, still maintained their cattle operation, still enjoyed the beauty and solitude of their mountain valley. But they lived differently now, with a respect for their environment that bordered on reverence and a recognition that they were guests in a landscape that belonged ultimately to creatures far more powerful than themselves. The bear itself was never seen again in their immediate area, though occasional reports placed similar animals in various locations throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Whether their encounter had been with a unique individual or simply an example of behavior that remained hidden from human observation most of the time, they would never know. What they did know was that their lives had been permanently changed by a few hours of terror on an October night, and that the changes had made them not just more cautious, but more alive to the reality of living in one of the last wild places in America. The price of that education had been high, but in the end, they'd decided it was worth paying to remain part of a landscape where such encounters were still possible. The rebuilt Harper Ranch stood as a testament to both human resilience and the enduring power of wild America, a place where the possibility of sudden encounter with untamed nature remained real and immediate. In a world increasingly dominated by human control and predictability, their story served as a reminder that some forces remained beyond human dominion, and that acknowledging that fact was perhaps the beginning of wisdom. The next stories. When winter comes early. The weather station at Nome recorded the temperature drop at precisely 11:47 a.m. on December 2nd, 2024. What had been a relatively mild early winter morning of -12 degrees Fahrenheit plummeted to -38 in less than 4 hours. The sudden Arctic blast, driven by a massive low-pressure system moving in from the Bering Sea, would later be classified as one of the most severe weather events to hit western Alaska in decades. But for Samuel Price and his family, huddled in their remote cabin 27 miles northeast of Nome, the approaching storm represented something far more immediate and terrifying than meteorological statistics. Samuel Price had built the cabin with his own hands over 3 summers, starting in 2019. At 44, he possessed the lean, weathered build of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades working Alaska's commercial fishing fleet before deciding to try his hand at subsistence living. His calloused fingers, permanently stained with engine oil and marked by countless small scars from fishing hooks and metal edges, had carefully fitted each log, sealed every joint, and reinforced every beam of the structure that now served as his family's primary residence. The cabin sat on a slight rise, overlooking the Chinook River, positioned strategically to catch the winter sun while providing natural windbreaks from the prevailing northwest storms. Samuel had chosen the location after consulting with Jonas Kanguk, an Inupiat elder from nearby Shishmaref, who had hunted and fished these lands for over 60 years. Jonas had warned him about the seasonal patterns of wildlife movement, particularly the increasing tendency of polar bears to venture further inland as sea ice conditions became more unpredictable. "Bears follow the scent," Jonas had told him in his measured, careful English. "Food scent, human scent, anything that means survival. When the ice fails them, they become different. Desperate bears are dangerous bears." Samuel had listened respectfully, but in the back of his mind, he calculated odds and distances. Polar bears were primarily coastal creatures. His cabin was inland, separated from the Bering Sea by more than 15 miles of tundra and low hills. The chances seemed remote enough to be manageable. Laura Price, 40 years old and originally from Portland, Oregon, had adapted to Alaska life with a determination that surprised even her husband. A former elementary school teacher with a master's degree in education, she had embraced the challenges of homeschooling their 2 daughters while managing the complex logistics of subsistence living. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature gray from the stress and demands of their chosen lifestyle, was always pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands, once soft and suited for holding chalk and grading papers, had developed calluses from splitting wood, preparing fish, and maintaining the countless small systems that kept their isolated household functioning. Emily Price, 9 years old, possessed her mother's thoughtful nature combined with her father's practical instincts. Small for her age, but remarkably observant, she had learned to read weather patterns, animal tracks, and the subtle changes in her parents' expressions that indicated concern or danger. Her dark hair, usually braided to keep it out of her face, framed a serious expression that seemed older than her years. Emily had been born in Anchorage, but had spent most of her conscious life in various remote locations as her family pursued increasingly isolated living situations. Grace Price, at 12, represented the bridge between childhood and the accelerated maturity that Alaska demanded from its young residents. Tall for her age and athletic, she possessed an instinctive understanding of wilderness skills that impressed even her father. Grace could identify animal tracks in fresh snow, start a fire in wet conditions, and had already proven herself capable of handling emergency situations with remarkable composure. Her sandy brown hair, inherited from her father, was often tucked under a wool cap that made her appear older than her years. The Price family had chosen this particular location for their winter residence after spending the previous summer months in a series of temporary camps, following seasonal fishing and hunting opportunities. Samuel's long-term plan involved establishing a sustainable homestead that could provide year-round security while offering his daughters an education in self-reliance that no conventional school could match. Laura supported this vision, though she sometimes worried about the social isolation and the risks inherent in their chosen lifestyle. Their cabin measured 24 feet by 18 feet, with walls constructed from locally harvested spruce logs, each one carefully selected, cut, and fitted during the brief summer building season. The foundation consisted of concrete piers set below the permafrost line, elevating the structure 18 inches off the ground to prevent frost heave and allow air circulation. The roof featured a steep pitch designed to shed snow efficiently, covered with corrugated metal and insulated with 8 inches of fiberglass batting. Inside, the cabin's single room was divided into functional areas by carefully positioned furniture and hanging blankets. The wood-burning stove, a heavy cast-iron unit salvaged from a defunct mining operation, dominated the central space and provided both heat and cooking capability. A raised sleeping platform along the north wall accommodated the family's bedrolls and personal belongings, while the south wall featured built-in shelving for food storage, books, and essential supplies. Samuel had installed a sophisticated ventilation system, crucial for preventing carbon monoxide buildup during the long winter months when the cabin would remain sealed against the elements. The main door, constructed from 2 layers of quarter-inch plywood with rigid foam insulation between, featured a deadbolt lock and a heavy wooden bar that could be dropped into brackets for additional security. 2 small windows, double-paned and positioned strategically for light and observation, could be shuttered from the inside using hinged wooden covers. The family's daily routine had evolved over their 3 months of winter residence to accommodate the extreme conditions and limited daylight. Samuel typically rose before dawn, to stoke the fire and check the weather conditions, using a battery-powered radio to receive updates from the National Weather Service station in Nome. Laura would prepare breakfast while monitoring the girls' morning lessons, which began early to take advantage of available natural light. Their food supplies, carefully calculated and stored, included commercially purchased staples, supplemented by fish and game that Samuel had harvested during the fall season. 3 large chest freezers, powered by a small generator and backup battery system, contained salmon, caribou, and various smaller game animals. Dried goods filled multiple sealed containers, and Laura maintained detailed inventory lists to ensure proper rationing throughout the winter months. Water came from a well that Samuel had drilled the previous summer, reaching 42 feet to access unfrozen groundwater. A hand pump, supplemented by an electric pump powered by their solar panel array, brought water to a holding tank inside the cabin. The system included heating elements to prevent freezing and filters to ensure water quality. Communication with the outside world relied on a high-frequency radio system capable of reaching Nome and other communities within a 100-mile radius. Samuel maintained regular contact with other remote residents and checked in weekly with Jonas Kanguk, who served as an informal coordinator for the scattered homesteaders in the region. A satellite phone provided backup communication, though its battery life and limited coverage area made it unsuitable for regular use. The Price family's nearest neighbors, Jim and Martha Kowalski, lived 12 miles to the southwest in a similar but larger cabin complex. Jim, a retired aerospace engineer from Seattle, had moved to Alaska 15 years earlier with his wife, seeking the same independence and self-reliance that motivated the Price family. The Kowalskis maintained more extensive facilities, including a workshop, greenhouse, and larger generator system, but they shared the same fundamental commitment to subsistence living. Regular communication between the two families occurred via radio, typically each evening at 7 o'clock. These conversations served multiple purposes, sharing weather observations, coordinating supply needs, and providing the social interaction that helped combat the psychological challenges of isolation. Jim Kowalski, with his engineering background, often provided technical advice for equipment problems, while Martha, a former nurse, served as the informal medical consultant for their small community. On December 2nd, the morning radio contact with the Kowalskis had included discussion of the approaching weather system. Jim had received updated forecasts indicating that the storm would be more severe than initially predicted, with temperatures potentially dropping below -40 and wind speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Both families agreed to increase their preparedness measures and maintain more frequent radio contact until the weather passed. Samuel's weather monitoring equipment, consisting of a digital thermometer, barometer, wind gauge, and precipitation meter, confirmed the approaching system's intensity. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for 18 hours, and wind speeds were already gusting above 30 miles per hour from the northwest. The temperature drop was particularly concerning because it indicated the presence of an Arctic air mass that could persist for several days. Laura spent the morning double-checking their emergency supplies and reviewing evacuation procedures with the girls. Though actual evacuation during such severe weather would be extremely dangerous, she believed in maintaining preparedness protocols that could be implemented if circumstances required immediate departure. Their emergency packs, stored near the main door, contained survival essentials, including fire-starting materials, emergency food, first aid supplies, and winter clothing. The family's transportation consisted of a snowmobile and emergency sleds, though the approaching weather conditions would make travel extremely hazardous. Samuel maintained the snowmobile meticulously, but temperatures below -35 significantly affected engine performance and battery life. The emergency sleds, designed for human-powered transport, represented a last resort option for evacuation if mechanical transportation failed. As the afternoon progressed, the wind began to increase dramatically, and snow started falling in heavy, wind-driven sheets that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. The cabin structure groaned and creaked as wind gusts tested the integrity of Samuel's construction, but the building held firm against the mounting storm. Inside, the family maintained their normal routine while remaining alert to changing conditions. Emily and Grace continued their afternoon lessons, working on mathematics problems, while Laura prepared dinner using ingredients from their carefully managed stores. Samuel monitored weather conditions and maintained radio contact with other area residents, sharing observations and coordinating response plans. The storm's severity was becoming apparent to everyone in the region, and several families reported power outages and equipment failures. At 4:30 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a blizzard warning for the entire Seward Peninsula, predicting sustained winds of 40 to 60 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 75 miles per hour. The temperature forecast called for lows between -40 and -50 degrees, with wind chill values potentially reaching -80. The warning advised residents to avoid all unnecessary travel and to prepare for possible power outages lasting several days. Samuel's evening radio check with the Kowalskis revealed that their neighbors were experiencing similar conditions but remained secure in their larger facility. Jim reported that his backup generator was functioning properly and they had sufficient fuel reserves to maintain power throughout the projected storm duration. Both families agreed to attempt radio contact every 2 hours instead of their usual once-daily schedule. The Price family's dinner conversation included discussion of storm safety procedures and emergency protocols. Samuel reviewed the location of emergency supplies, explained the operation of backup heating and lighting systems, and emphasized the importance of staying together if evacuation became necessary. Laura reminded the girls about carbon monoxide safety and the signs of inadequate ventilation that could indicate dangerous conditions. As darkness fell at approximately 5:15 p.m., the storm's intensity continued to increase. Wind-driven snow created a constant white noise that penetrated the cabin's walls, and the temperature outside dropped below -35 degrees. Inside, the wood-burning stove maintained comfortable conditions, but Samuel noted that their wood consumption was higher than normal due to the extreme cold and wind infiltration. The family's evening routine proceeded normally, despite the challenging weather. Grace and Emily worked on their reading assignments, while Laura prepared hot drinks and snacks. Samuel conducted equipment checks, ensuring that their heating, lighting, and communication systems remained functional. The battery bank that supported their electrical systems showed full charge, thanks to careful management and the recent operation of their backup generator. At 7 p.m., radio contact with the Kowalskis confirmed that both families were weathering the storm successfully. Jim reported wind gusts that he estimated at over 60 miles per hour, and both families noted temperature readings below -40 degrees. They agreed to maintain 2-hour radio schedules throughout the night, understanding that communications might become difficult if equipment failures occurred. The Price family's bedtime routine began earlier than usual, recognizing that the storm would likely continue through the night and into the following day. Samuel banked the fire carefully, ensuring sufficient coals to maintain heat while minimizing wood consumption. Laura organized morning supplies and checked their water systems for any signs of freezing. The girls prepared their sleeping area and gathered additional blankets for extra warmth. Before settling in for the night, Samuel conducted a final exterior check using a high-powered flashlight to examine the cabin's immediate surroundings. The wind and snow made observation difficult, but he could see that the structure was holding up well against the storm's assault. Snow had accumulated against the north wall to a depth of approximately 18 inches, providing additional insulation against the wind. The family slept fitfully through the night, awakened periodically by particularly strong wind gusts that shook the cabin's frame. Samuel rose twice to add wood to the fire and check interior temperature readings. The wood-burning stove's thermal mass helped maintain relatively stable conditions, but the extreme outside temperatures and wind infiltration required constant attention to fuel management. Dawn on December 3rd brought little relief from the storm conditions. The wind continued at sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped to -42 degrees. Snow accumulation outside the cabin had reached nearly 3 feet, creating drifts that partially obscured the lower windows. Samuel's morning radio attempt to contact the Kowalskis met with static and interference, suggesting that atmospheric conditions were affecting radio propagation. Laura prepared breakfast while Samuel worked to clear snow from the cabin's ventilation systems and the entrance door. The accumulation had been so rapid that the door required significant effort to open, and snow immediately blew into the interior space. Samuel quickly shoveled a path from the door to their woodpile and emergency supply cache, understanding that access to these resources could become critical if the storm persisted. The girls adapted to the storm conditions with remarkable resilience, treating the situation as an adventure rather than a crisis. Emily helped her mother with meal preparation, while Grace assisted Samuel with equipment checks and supply organization. Their positive attitudes helped maintain family morale despite the challenging circumstances. At 9 a.m., Samuel succeeded in establishing radio contact with Jim Kowalski, who reported that their situation remained stable but concerning. The Kowalskis had experienced a brief power outage during the night when wind-blown debris damaged their primary generator's exhaust system. Jim had been able to make temporary repairs, but he expressed concern about their backup system's reliability if additional damage occurred. The conversation also included discussion of wildlife observations that had begun to concern both families. Jim reported unusual animal tracks near his compound, including what appeared to be large bear prints. Though the wind and snow made definitive identification difficult, Samuel acknowledged similar observations around his own cabin, noting that their usual wildlife visitors, primarily Arctic foxes and occasional caribou, seemed to have disappeared entirely. Jonas Kanguk's voice crackled through the radio static as he joined the conversation from his location in Shishmaref. The elders' weather observations confirmed that the storm system was among the most severe he had experienced in recent decades. More concerning, Jonas reported that coastal communities were experiencing unusual polar bear activity, with several animals moving inland to seek shelter and food sources. "Ice is breaking up wrong this year," Jonas explained, his voice barely audible through the atmospheric interference. "Bears losing hunting grounds earlier than usual. When storms drive them inland, they become unpredictable, dangerous." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Polar bears represented the Arctic's apex predator, capable of remarkable intelligence and persistence when seeking food. An adult male could weigh over 800 pounds and possessed the strength to tear through most conventional barriers. Their sense of smell could detect food sources from miles away, and their hunting instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, made them formidable adversaries. The morning hours passed slowly as the storm continued with undiminished intensity. Samuel monitored their supplies and calculated consumption rates, determining that they possessed adequate resources to weather several more days of extreme conditions. Their food supplies remained sufficient, though water conservation had become important due to the energy required to operate the well pump in extreme cold. Laura conducted lessons with the girls, using the enforced isolation as an opportunity to explore subjects that required concentrated attention. Mathematics, reading, and science projects helped pass the time while maintaining educational momentum. The cabin's interior, though cramped by normal standards, provided adequate space for their activities when properly organized. At 11:30 a.m., a sound outside the cabin caused Samuel to pause in his equipment maintenance. Through the wind noise, he had detected what sounded like heavy footsteps in the snow near the building's north wall. Moving carefully to avoid creating noise, he approached the shuttered window and listened intently. The sound repeated several times, deliberate heavy movements that seemed too large and purposeful to be caused by wind-blown debris. Samuel retrieved his rifle, a .30-06 bolt-action weapon that he maintained meticulously for hunting and protection purposes. The rifle was loaded with high-powered ammunition, suitable for large game, but he hoped that its presence would merely provide psychological comfort rather than practical necessity. Moving to the window, he carefully opened the shutter a few inches and peered out into the storm. Visibility remained severely limited, but Samuel could distinguish a large, pale shape moving slowly along the north wall of the cabin. The creature appeared to be investigating the structure, pausing frequently, as if testing for weaknesses or entry points. Its size and movement patterns confirmed Samuel's worst fears. A polar bear had discovered their location and was conducting what could only be described as reconnaissance. Laura noticed her husband's tension and approached quietly, understanding immediately that something serious had attracted his attention. Samuel gestured for silence and motioned for her to gather the girls into the sleeping area at the back of the cabin. Moving with practiced efficiency, Laura guided Emily and Grace to the elevated platform and used hand signals to indicate the need for absolute quiet. The bear's investigation continued for nearly 15 minutes, during which Samuel tracked its movement around the cabin's perimeter. The animal appeared to be testing the strength of the walls, door, and windows, pausing at each potential entry point. Its behavior suggested intelligence and purpose that went beyond casual curiosity about human habitation. Through the radio static, Jim Kowalski's voice crackled with urgent concern. "Samuel, are you receiving? We're seeing large tracks around our compound, suggest extreme caution with exterior access." Samuel reached for the radio handset while maintaining visual contact with the area outside his window. "Jim, we have visual confirmation of a large polar bear investigating our cabin. Animal appears to be testing structural integrity. Recommend you secure all entry points and avoid exterior activity." Jonas Kanguk's voice joined the radio conversation, his tone carrying decades of experience with dangerous wildlife encounters. "Bears in storms become very aggressive. They seek warm spaces, food scent, any opportunity for shelter. Once they identify human habitation, they can be very persistent, very dangerous." The elder's advice proved prophetic as the bear's behavior became increasingly aggressive. What had begun as apparent curiosity evolved into deliberate attempts to find weaknesses in the cabin's defenses. The animal pushed against the main door with sufficient force to cause the entire structure to shake, testing the strength of Samuel's construction and the effectiveness of his security measures. Laura had positioned the girls in the most protected area of the cabin and was quietly explaining the situation in terms that conveyed seriousness without creating panic. Emily and Grace, though frightened, remained calm and attentive to their parents' instructions. Their wilderness experience had prepared them for dangerous encounters, though nothing in their previous experience compared to the threat represented by a determined polar bear. Samuel's mind raced through potential responses to their situation. The cabin's construction was solid, but polar bears possessed remarkable strength and persistence. The main door, while reinforced, represented the most vulnerable entry point. The windows, though small, could potentially be breached by a determined animal. Their emergency escape routes were limited by the storm conditions and the bear's presence. The radio crackled with increased activity as word of the bear sightings spread through the sparse network of remote residents. Multiple families reported similar encounters, suggesting that several bears had moved inland seeking shelter from the storm. The situation was developing into a regional emergency that would require coordinated response efforts once weather conditions permitted rescue operations. At 12:15 p.m., the bear's behavior escalated dramatically. Instead of continuing its investigation of the cabin's perimeter, the animal focused its attention on the main door with an intensity that suggested deliberate intent to gain entry. Samuel could hear the scraping of claws against wood and metal, accompanied by the deep, rumbling vocalizations that indicated an aroused and potentially aggressive polar bear. The first direct attack on the door came without warning. The entire cabin shook as 800 pounds of muscle and determination slammed against the reinforced entrance. Samuel's construction held, but the impact demonstrated the animal's serious intent and formidable capability. Laura instinctively moved to shield the girls, while Samuel positioned himself to defend the family if the bear succeeded in gaining entry. The assault continued with increasing intensity as the bear alternated between striking the door with its massive paws and attempting to bite and claw through the wooden barriers. Each impact sent shockwaves through the cabin's frame, and Samuel could see that the doorframe was beginning to show stress fractures despite his careful construction techniques. Through the radio, Jim Kowalski's voice carried urgent concern as he monitored the developing crisis. "Samuel, our situation is deteriorating rapidly. We have multiple bears around our compound, and they're showing similar aggressive behavior. Weather conditions prevent any immediate rescue response." Jonas Kanguk provided crucial advice based on his lifetime of experience with polar bear encounters. Do not attempt to scare bears away with noise. Polar bears in storms are desperate, not afraid. If structure fails, seek highest position in dwelling. Bears are excellent climbers but prefer easy access to prey. The elder's words proved prescient as the bear's assault on the door intensified. The animal had apparently detected the presence of humans inside the cabin and was now committed to gaining entry. Its attacks became more systematic, targeting the weakest points around the doorframe and testing the effectiveness of the deadbolt and security bar. Samuel made the difficult decision to prepare for the possibility that the bear might succeed in breaching their defenses. Moving quietly, he gathered emergency supplies and positioned them near the sleeping platform, which represented the cabin's highest and most defensible position. The platform's elevation provided strategic advantage, and its position against the back wall offered some protection from multiple approach angles. Laura organized essential items for the girls while maintaining calm efficiency that helped control their fear. Emergency blankets, first aid supplies, and the satellite phone were positioned within easy reach. The radio continued to function, providing communication with the outside world, but Samuel understood that rescue would be impossible until weather conditions improved. At 12:45 p.m., the sound of splintering wood indicated that the bear's assault was beginning to succeed. The doorframe, despite Samuel's reinforcement efforts, was separating from the cabin's wall structure under the repeated impacts. Each blow from the animal's massive paws created larger gaps that allowed frigid air and snow to enter the cabin's interior. The bear's vocalizations became more intense as it sensed progress in its attack. The deep growls and huffing sounds indicated an animal that was fully committed to gaining entry and would not be deterred by minor obstacles. Samuel estimated that the door's failure was imminent and began moving his family toward their prepared defensive position. Emily and Grace responded to their parents' urgent instructions with remarkable composure, gathering their emergency supplies and moving quickly to the sleeping platform. Their wilderness training proved invaluable as they prepared for what might become a life-or-death struggle for survival. Laura positioned herself between the girls and the door, while Samuel prepared to confront the bear if it succeeded in entering the cabin. The final assault on the door began at 1:10 p.m. with a series of impacts that demonstrated the polar bear's full strength and determination. The door frame separated completely from the wall, and the reinforced door itself began to buckle under the repeated attacks. Samuel could see the animal's massive claws extending through the growing gaps as it worked to enlarge the opening. Through the radio, the Price family's desperate situation was being monitored by everyone in their communication network. Jim Kowalski reported his own deteriorating circumstances as multiple bears continued to pressure his compound's defenses. Jonas Kanguk provided steady guidance, sharing traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior and survival strategies that might help the families endure their ordeal. The door's catastrophic failure occurred at 1:23 p.m. when the bear's final assault tore the entire assembly from its hinges and frame. The massive animal immediately filled the doorway, its white fur matted with snow and ice, its dark eyes scanning the cabin's interior for signs of human presence. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted as Arctic air rushed through the demolished entrance. Samuel faced an impossible choice between attempting to drive off an animal that outweighed him by several hundred pounds or protecting his family through strategic retreat. The bear's size and evident determination made direct confrontation extremely dangerous, but the cabin's confined space offered limited options for evasion or defense. The polar bear entered the cabin with deliberate confidence, its massive frame barely fitting through the doorway that Samuel had sized for human access. The animal's presence dominated the small space, and its intelligent dark eyes quickly identified the human occupants clustered on the sleeping platform. The bear's body language indicated curiosity rather than immediate aggression, but Samuel understood that the situation could change instantly. Laura had positioned Emily and Grace behind her on the platform, using her body to shield them from the bear's direct attention. The girls remained remarkably calm, following their mother's whispered instructions to avoid sudden movements or sounds that might trigger an aggressive response. Their wilderness experience had taught them that many dangerous animal encounters could be survived through proper behavior and patience. Samuel slowly raised his rifle, understanding that he would have only one opportunity to stop the bear if it decided to attack. The weapon's .30-06 ammunition was capable of killing a polar bear, but shot placement would be critical, and the confined space made accurate shooting extremely challenging. The bear's intelligence was evident as it seemed to assess the threat represented by the rifle while continuing its evaluation of the cabin's occupants. The standoff continued for nearly 10 minutes as the bear explored the cabin's interior while keeping the human family under constant observation. The animal investigated their food supplies, equipment, and personal belongings with the methodical thoroughness of an apex predator evaluating a new territory. Its behavior suggested curiosity and assessment, rather than immediate predatory intent. Through the demolished doorway, snow and frigid air continued to pour into the cabin, rapidly lowering the interior temperature toward lethal levels. Samuel realized that exposure might become as dangerous as the bear itself if they remained in the compromised structure for an extended period. The family's winter clothing provided some protection, but the extreme conditions would eventually overcome their defenses. The bear's investigation of the cabin reached the area beneath the sleeping platform, where it discovered the family's hidden emergency supplies and additional food stores. The animal's interest in these resources intensified, and it began to tear through containers and packaging with its powerful claws. This behavior brought the bear into close proximity to the family's position and increased the tension of an already critical situation. Jonas Kanguk's voice crackled through the radio, with advice based on traditional knowledge and decades of experience. Bears in dwellings become territorial. They claim space as their own. Human scent makes them aggressive. If possible, must remove family from bears' claimed territory. The elders' guidance highlighted the complexity of their situation. The bear appeared to be claiming the cabin as a shelter from the storm, which meant that it would likely remain in the structure for an extended period. The family's continued presence would eventually trigger aggressive behavior as the animal asserted dominance over its new territory. Samuel made the agonizing decision that evacuation might represent their best chance for survival. Despite the extreme weather conditions outside, the storm continued with undiminished intensity, but remaining in the cabin with an increasingly territorial polar bear might be more dangerous than facing the elements. Their emergency shelter supplies could provide temporary protection while they sought a more secure location. The evacuation attempt began at 2:15 p.m. as Samuel carefully gathered essential survival equipment while maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position and behavior. The animal continued its investigation of the cabin's resources but showed increased agitation as the humans began moving around the small space. Laura prepared the girls for immediate departure, ensuring that they wore all available winter clothing and carried emergency supplies. The bear's reaction to the family's preparation activities was immediate and alarming. The animal's body language shifted from curious investigation to alert aggression, as it apparently interpreted their movements as threatening or territorial challenges. The bear positioned itself between the family and the demolished doorway, effectively blocking their most direct escape route. Samuel realized that their evacuation would require careful timing and possibly the use of distraction techniques to create an opportunity for the family to exit the cabin safely. The bear's size and position made it impossible to simply walk past the animal, and any aggressive action might trigger a full attack that would be devastating in the confined space. The radio communication with their support network intensified as word spread about the Price family's desperate situation. Jim Kowalski reported that his own circumstances had stabilized somewhat. With the bears around his compound having moved on to seek other shelter options. Several other families provided encouragement and tactical advice, though their ability to provide direct assistance was limited by the storm conditions. At 2:35 p.m., Samuel attempted to create a distraction by tossing emergency flares toward the far end of the cabin, hoping to draw the bear's attention away from the doorway long enough for his family to escape. The bright flares successfully attracted the animal's interest, and it moved to investigate the unusual lights and chemical smells. This provided a brief window of opportunity for evacuation. Laura moved first, carrying Emily and leading Grace toward the demolished doorway, while Samuel maintained his position with the rifle. The bear's attention remained focused on the flares for several crucial seconds, allowing the girls to exit the cabin and move toward their prepared emergency shelter location. Laura followed immediately, guiding her daughters through the deep snow and wind-driven conditions. Samuel's exit from the cabin proved more challenging as the bear quickly lost interest in the flares and returned its attention to the human occupants. The animal moved to block the doorway again, forcing Samuel to consider more aggressive tactics to secure his escape route. The confined space made rifle use extremely dangerous, particularly with his family positioned just outside the structure. The desperate situation called for extreme measures, and Samuel decided to use the cabin's propane heating system to create a more significant distraction. Opening the valve on their backup heating unit, he allowed propane to fill the air near the bear's position before igniting it with another emergency flare. The resulting flash and explosion of flame created enough confusion to allow his escape from the cabin. The family reunited outside the cabin in the storm's full fury, with temperatures below -40 degrees and wind speeds that made standing difficult. Their emergency shelter, a reinforced tent designed for extreme conditions, was positioned approximately 50 yards from the cabin in a location that provided some protection from the wind. Reaching this shelter became their immediate priority for survival. The trek through the storm conditions tested every aspect of the family's wilderness training and equipment. The deep snow, driven by winds that sometimes exceeded 50 miles per hour, made each step a struggle against the elements. Emily and Grace, despite their young ages, demonstrated remarkable endurance and determination as they fought their way through conditions that would challenge experienced Arctic explorers. Samuel carried the emergency radio and rifle while helping to guide his family toward their shelter location. The bear remained in the cabin, apparently satisfied with its new territorial claim and shelter from the storm. However, Samuel understood that their proximity to the animal's new den would make their situation precarious for as long as they remained in the area. The emergency shelter, when they finally reached it, provided crucial protection from the wind and snow, though the interior temperature remained well below freezing. Laura worked efficiently to organize their emergency supplies and establish heating using portable chemical warmers and a small camp stove. The girls helped with shelter preparation while Samuel maintained watch for any signs that the bear might be following them. Radio communication from their new position confirmed that their evacuation had been successful, though their overall situation remained critical. Jim Kowalski and other area residents monitored their progress while providing tactical advice and emotional support. Jonas Kanguk emphasized the importance of maintaining warmth and avoiding hypothermia, which could become life-threatening within hours under such extreme conditions. The family's emergency supplies, though carefully planned and well-equipped, were designed for temporary use rather than extended survival in extreme conditions. Their food would last several days, but their heating fuel and battery power for communication equipment were more limited. Samuel calculated that they could maintain their current position for perhaps 48 hours before resource constraints would force them to seek alternative shelter. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the storm showed no signs of diminishing, and weather forecasts suggested that conditions would remain extreme for at least another 24 hours. The family's situation was stable for the immediate term, but the combination of extreme cold, limited resources, and proximity to a territorial polar bear created multiple threats that would require careful management. The bear's continued occupation of their cabin was confirmed through periodic observation, though Samuel avoided approaching close enough to provoke another confrontation. The animal appeared to have settled into the structure for extended residence, making it unlikely that the family could safely return to their primary shelter until the bear decided to move on independently. Evening brought additional challenges as temperatures dropped even further, and the limited daylight disappeared entirely. The family's emergency shelter, while adequate for temporary protection, required constant attention to maintain livable conditions. Laura managed their heating resources carefully while Samuel monitored weather conditions and maintained radio contact with their support network. The girls adapted to their emergency situation with resilience that impressed their parents and the other adults monitoring their situation via radio. Emily and Grace helped with shelter maintenance, conserved body heat through shared warmth, and maintained positive attitudes despite the severity of their circumstances. Their wilderness training and family preparation for emergency situations proved invaluable for psychological as well as practical survival. During the night, the family took shifts maintaining their heating system and monitoring for any signs of bear activity near their emergency shelter. The polar bear remained in the cabin, apparently using the structure as intended shelter from the storm. Occasional sounds of the animal moving around inside the building reminded the family of their displaced status and the ongoing threat to their safety. Samuel's radio communications during the night shift included detailed discussions of rescue possibilities and resource management strategies. The extreme weather conditions made immediate rescue impossible, but several agencies were preparing response efforts that could be implemented once the storm passed. Jim Kowalski and other area residents provided continuous moral support and practical advice based on their own experiences with emergency situations. Dawn on December 4th brought slight improvement in weather conditions, with wind speeds decreasing to approximately 30 miles per hour, though temperatures remained below -35 degrees. The storm's intensity was beginning to diminish, raising hopes for eventual rescue operations, but conditions remained too severe for safe travel or emergency response activities. The family's emergency supplies were holding up adequately, though Samuel noted that their heating fuel consumption was higher than calculated due to the extreme conditions and the need to maintain shelter temperature above lethal levels. Their food remained sufficient, and water supplies were being managed through snow melting and careful conservation practices. During the morning hours, the polar bear finally vacated the cabin, apparently moving on to seek other shelter or hunting opportunities. Samuel conducted careful reconnaissance to confirm the animal's departure before considering whether the family could safely return to their primary shelter. The cabin's interior had been severely damaged by the bear's presence, with insulation torn apart, food supplies destroyed, and structural damage that would require significant repair efforts. The decision to return to the cabin involved weighing multiple risk factors, including the possibility of the bear's return, the structural integrity of the damaged building, and the family's ability to maintain adequate heating in a compromised shelter. Samuel's inspection revealed that while the cabin remained structurally sound, the destroyed door and damaged insulation would make temperature control extremely difficult. Working together, the family managed to create temporary repairs to the cabin's entrance using emergency materials and tools from their survival supplies. A heavy tarp, secured with rope and wooden braces, provided wind protection, though the improvised door offered minimal security against another bear encounter. Interior insulation was partially restored using sleeping bags, spare clothing, and emergency blankets. The cabin's heating system remained functional, and the family was able to restore interior temperatures to livable levels within several hours of their return. The psychological comfort of being back in their primary shelter was significant, even though the physical security had been compromised. Laura organized cleanup efforts while Samuel assessed the extent of damage and planned more permanent repairs. Radio communications with their support network confirmed that several rescue agencies were preparing response operations as weather conditions continued to improve. The Alaska State Troopers, local volunteer search and rescue teams, and wildlife management officers were coordinating efforts that could reach the Price family's location within 24 hours if weather trends continued. Jim Kowalski's situation had stabilized completely, with the bears that had threatened his compound having moved on to other areas. His facility's more substantial construction and better defensive measures had proven effective against the polar bear intrusion, though he acknowledged that the Price family's experience highlighted the serious nature of the wildlife threat they all faced. Jonas Kunguk provided valuable perspective on the bear encounter, explaining that the extreme weather conditions had driven the animals to unusual behavior patterns. The elders' traditional knowledge helped the family understand that their experience, while traumatic, was part of natural cycles that Arctic peoples had dealt with for generations. His guidance about future prevention measures would prove crucial for their continued residence in bear territory. The afternoon of December 4th brought the first signs of rescue activity as the Alaska State Trooper helicopter conducted reconnaissance flights in their area. Radio communication with the aircraft confirmed the family's location and status, though landing conditions remained too dangerous for immediate evacuation. The flight crew provided updated weather forecasts, suggesting that rescue operations could begin the following morning. Samuel used the additional time to continue repairs on the cabin's defenses and to prepare for the possibility of returning to normal life after their ordeal. The experience had highlighted weaknesses in their preparation and security measures that would need to be addressed before they could safely continue their subsistence lifestyle. The bear encounter had demonstrated that their remote location, while offering independence, also presented serious risks that required constant vigilance and better preparation. Laura worked with the girls to process their emotional responses to the crisis, helping them understand that their survival had been due to proper preparation, family cooperation, and good decision-making under pressure. The experience would become an important part of their wilderness education, demonstrating both the dangers and the rewards of their chosen lifestyle. The evening radio schedule brought news that rescue operations would begin at first light on December 5th, with multiple agencies coordinating evacuation and assistance efforts. The family would be transported to Nome for medical evaluation and debriefing, though they could return to their cabin once security improvements were implemented and weather conditions stabilized. The final night in their storm-damaged cabin was spent in careful preparation for evacuation and planning for their eventual return. Samuel documented the bear encounter and property damage for wildlife authorities who would investigate the incident. Laura organized their personal belongings and essential items for transport, while the girls helped with packing and cleanup activities. Dawn on December 5th brought clear skies and diminished winds for the first time in 4 days. The rescue helicopter arrived at 8:30 a.m., piloted by Alaska State Trooper personnel with extensive experience in Arctic rescue operations. The family's evacuation proceeded smoothly, with all members found to be in good health, despite their ordeal. The helicopter flight to Nome provided the family's first comprehensive view of the storm's impact on their area. Snow accumulations exceeded 4 feet in most locations, and evidence of widespread wildlife displacement was visible throughout the region. Several other families had experienced similar bear encounters, though none as severe as the Price family's cabin intrusion. Medical evaluation at the Nome Regional Health Center confirmed that all family members had survived their ordeal without serious physical injury. Emily and Grace showed remarkable resilience and were praised by medical staff for their calm behavior during the crisis. Samuel and Laura were treated for minor cold exposure injuries, but were found to be in excellent health overall. The debriefing process with Alaska State Troopers and wildlife management officials provided valuable information about polar bear behavior and emergency response procedures. The Price family's experience contributed to improved guidelines for remote residents dealing with wildlife encounters and extreme weather events. Their survival story became a case study in effective emergency preparation and family cooperation under extreme stress. Wildlife authorities conducted extensive investigation of the cabin and surrounding area, documenting evidence of the bear encounter and assessing ongoing threat levels. The investigation confirmed that multiple polar bears had moved inland during the storm, creating temporary but serious risks for remote residents throughout the region. Enhanced warning systems and response protocols were implemented based on lessons learned from the incident. The Price family's return to their cabin occurred 3 weeks later, after extensive security improvements and repairs were completed with assistance from local contractors and volunteer organizations. Enhanced door and window security, improved food storage systems, and better communication equipment reduce the likelihood of future bear encounters while maintaining their subsistence lifestyle. The experience had profound impacts on the family's approach to wilderness living, leading to improved preparation, enhanced safety protocols, and deeper appreciation for the unpredictable nature of Arctic survival. Their story inspired other remote residents to evaluate their own preparedness and security measures, contributing to improved safety throughout the region's scattered homesteading community. Emily and Grace returned to their wilderness education with enhanced understanding of survival principles and crisis management. Their behavior during the emergency had demonstrated maturity and wilderness skills that impressed professional rescue personnel and wildlife experts. The experience became a foundation for their continued education in self-reliance and environmental awareness. Laura's role as the family's educator expanded to include crisis psychology and emergency preparedness training, drawing on their recent experience to enhance the girls' education in practical survival skills. Her teaching now incorporated real-world examples of decision-making under pressure and the importance of family cooperation during emergencies. Samuel's construction and preparation philosophy evolved to emphasize wildlife security and emergency response capabilities. His reputation as a wilderness safety expert grew throughout the region, and he began consulting with other families seeking to establish remote homesteads in bear territory. The cabin's reconstruction included design features specifically intended to prevent future wildlife intrusions. The incident's broader impact included changes to state and federal wildlife management policies regarding polar bear encounters and emergency response procedures. The Price family's detailed documentation of their experience contributed to improved understanding of bear behavior and more effective prevention strategies for remote residents. Jonas Kanguk's traditional knowledge proved crucial for understanding the cultural and historical context of polar bear encounters in the region. His guidance helped the Price family and other residents develop approaches to wilderness living that honored traditional Inupiat wisdom while incorporating modern safety technologies and communication systems. The story of the Price family's survival became part of the folklore of Alaska's remote communities, illustrating the importance of preparation, family unity, and respect for the natural environment's unpredictable power. Their experience continues to influence safety planning and emergency response development throughout the Arctic regions of North America. 6 months after their rescue, the Price family had successfully returned to their subsistence lifestyle with enhanced security measures and deeper appreciation for the challenges of Arctic survival. Their cabin, rebuilt with advanced wildlife deterrent systems and improved emergency capabilities, became a model for other families seeking to live safely in remote polar bear territory. The psychological impacts of their ordeal proved manageable through family support and professional counseling services available in Nome. Emily and Grace developed increased confidence in their wilderness abilities while maintaining healthy respect for the dangers inherent in their chosen lifestyle. Their experience reinforced the family's commitment to subsistence living while emphasizing the critical importance of proper preparation and emergency planning. The Price family's story continues to serve as an educational resource for wilderness safety training, emergency response development, and wildlife management policy formation. Their detailed documentation of the bear encounter and successful survival provides valuable insights for researchers, safety professionals, and other families pursuing similar lifestyles in challenging environments. Their experience demonstrates that with proper preparation, family cooperation, and respect for natural forces, it is possible to survive even the most challenging wilderness emergencies. The combination of traditional knowledge, modern safety equipment, and strong family bonds enabled them to overcome circumstances that could easily have resulted in tragedy. Their story stands as a testament to human resilience and the power of careful preparation in the face of nature's most formidable challenges.